It began with a fragment, a letter tucked in the folds of a 12th century ecclesiastical archive, unsigned, unsealed, and almost thrown away. The writer spoke not of sermons or saints, but of a weapon. A golden vessel once carried before kings, now said to be in the hands of warrior monks, not in Jerusalem, not in Ethiopia, but in the damp stone chambers beneath a Templar commandery. And then nothing, no mention again. Not in papal decrees, not in royal records. The trail died, or was buried. But what if it didn't? So you pause, caught between absurdity and awe. The Ark of the Covenant, cherished by prophets, lost by empires, resurfacing in the unlikeliest of hands. Maybe, maybe not. But once you begin following the whispers, they start getting louder. Picture it an overcast evening in rural France. A parchment retrieved during the renovation of a crumbling Templar chapel, ink faded but legible. It describes an object so sacred, so dangerous, that it had to be kept moving. Hidden from kings, hidden from popes, even hidden from history itself. The Ark of the Covenant, long thought to have vanished with the fall of Jerusalem, now entangled in the legacy of the Knights Templar. A religious artifact turned military relic. A symbol of divine fury turned into a prize of secret crusades. But what did the Templars really find beneath the Temple Mount? Why were they there for nearly a decade with no record of any public service? Why did they rise so quickly and fall even faster? And what vanished with them the night before their arrest? Tonight we'll follow the trail from ancient Israel to medieval Europe through underground vaults, coded scrolls, vanished fleets, and forbidden rituals. Each clue brings us closer to a singular, haunting question. Did the Templars discover the Ark of the Covenant? And if they did, where is it now? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. It was no ordinary box. Crafted from acacia wood and sheathed in gold, the Ark of the Covenant shimmered with an almost supernatural defiance. Roughly 4 feet long, 2.5 feet high, and topped by 2 golden cherubim whose wings stretched toward each other like a frozen embrace, it was never meant to be seen, casually, let alone touched. According to Scripture, even glancing inside without permission could strike a man dead. Handy if you're looking for divine deterrence. Less handy if you're trying to borrow it for a weekend. In the world of ancient Israel, the Ark wasn't just an artifact, it was a throne. Specifically, the mercy seat above the Ark was described as the earthly footstool of Yahweh, a space where God's presence would dwell and commune with high priests. The object traveled with the Israelites through the desert, a kind of mobile Sinai, and was carried into battle like a sacred battering ram. When the Israelites marched around Jericho and the city's walls crumbled, the Ark was there. When they faced off against the Philistines, the Ark was again front and center, until of course they lost it. And that's when things get interesting. When the Philistines captured the Ark, they didn't celebrate for long. Plagues followed. Statues of their gods shattered. At one point, tumors were mentioned, likely code for something unprintable, involving boils or worse. It got so bad that the Philistines loaded the Ark onto a cart, hitched up 2 cows, and essentially said, "Let's see where it goes." Not exactly the best Yelp review for a divine relic. The cows wandered back to Israelite territory, the Ark with them. But here's the thing. For all its sacred value, the Ark was wildly unpredictable. Sometimes it brought blessings, like when David danced in the streets as it returned to Jerusalem. Other times it left a trail of corpses. When a man named Uzzah reached out to steady it, just to keep it from falling, he died instantly. You could argue that God had anger management issues, or that the ark functioned more like a machine than a metaphor. And that brings us to one of the stranger interpretations, not just from theologians, but from physicists and archaeologists alike. Some suggest the ark operated more like a capacitor storing massive amounts of static electricity. Others propose that it housed radioactive materials, possibly explaining the afflictions suffered by those who mishandled it. Ancient accounts describe glowing light, thunderous sounds, and voices that echoed from nowhere. Whether symbolic or scientific, one message remains consistent: this was not something you wanted to tamper with lightly. Which raises a question that still baffles modern scholars. If the ark truly existed as described, and not simply as myth cloaked in poetry, why was it built with such precision? Why the gold lining, the acacia insulation, the rings and poles that ensured no one ever had to touch it directly? It wasn't just a ceremonial chest. It was built like a container for something volatile, something alive, something divine or dangerous. And if you accept that premise that the ark was real and constructed with intention, then you have to accept that someone somewhere knew how to make it, and possibly how to use it. The first known location for the ark was the tabernacle, a mobile temple in the wilderness. Later, it resided in Solomon's first temple in Jerusalem, behind a thick veil in the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter, and only once a year. It was hidden from the world, encased in ritual, surrounded by mystery. A literal black box of God's presence. And then one day, it was gone. Its disappearance is arguably one of the most consequential vanishing acts in human history. Think about it, an object central to the covenant between God and his people. The locus of divine communication carried through generations vanishes with barely a footnote in the biblical record. That's like misplacing the moon and only casually mentioning it in the weather report. This absence becomes even more curious when you examine other temple artifacts. Items like the menorah and the table of showbread are mentioned repeatedly in post-exilic texts, yet the ark is treated like a taboo, as if those who knew the truth were sworn to silence or terrified to say it aloud. One obscure tradition tucked within rabbinic commentary suggests that the ark was hidden by King Josiah before the Babylonian siege, buried beneath the Temple Mount to protect it. That story faded into the mist, but it never disappeared entirely. And centuries later, it would resurface, this time in the hands of a new brotherhood. Warriors, monks, builders, diggers, knights sworn to defend Jerusalem. But more importantly, perhaps sworn to recover what lay buried beneath it. And that returns us quietly to the matter of the Templars. If they arrived in Jerusalem with religious zeal, why did they spend nearly a decade tunneling under their headquarters? Why the secrecy? Why the sudden wealth and influence afterward? It would be easy to dismiss the whispers as romantic fantasy, unless you knew what they were supposedly looking for. Because if the ark was more than a relic, if it was a device, a conduit, or a kind of ancient technology, then it's no longer just a biblical curiosity. It's a weapon, a prize. And in a medieval world where popes clashed with kings and battles were won by symbols as much as by swords, it becomes very clear why someone would go to great lengths to possess it, or to keep it hidden forever. And while the mystery of its disappearance deepened with the fall of Jerusalem, its reappearance, if only as rumor in the hands of a select few Crusader knights, will shape every shadow we walk through from here onward. The year was 586 BCE. Babylon's armies surrounded Jerusalem like a noose, their battering rams crashing against the city's ancient walls, while smoke curled from rooftops set ablaze. Inside, the people of Judah huddled in fear. Some prayed, some plotted. All knew what was coming. When the breach finally came, It wasn't just a political defeat, it was an existential collapse. The First Temple, Solomon's crowning glory and the spiritual epicenter of an entire nation, was torn apart stone by sacred stone. The Babylonians looted, razed, and burned. They took priests, nobles, and scribes into exile. They left behind ash, silence, and a void. But one object was conspicuously absent from the lists of seized treasures. Among the bronze basins, gold menorahs, and ritual implements, one item simply vanished from the historical record: the Ark of the Covenant. This isn't an oversight. This is a screaming silence. We know from earlier texts meticulously detailed in the Book of Kings and the Chronicles that the Ark had been kept in the Holy of Holies, shielded by a curtain, and visited once a year by the high priest on Yom Kippur. It had been the crown jewel of Solomon's temple. Yet when the smoke cleared and Babylon catalogued its spoils, there was no mention of the Ark. Not one. And from that moment forward, it disappears from the pages of Scripture like a character killed off-screen in a drama with no explanation. Now scholars have offered several theories, each more awkward than the last. Some argue that the Ark was destroyed in the siege, melted down, reduced to rubble. But that's hard to square with the reverence surrounding it. It would be like burning the Declaration of Independence and not even bragging about it. Others propose it was taken to Babylon and hidden in the imperial treasury. A neat solution until you remember that later, Persian and Greek writers who had every opportunity to describe such a trophy never mentioned it once. No Babylonian text references it either. No carving, no theft recorded. It simply disappears. And then there's the more interesting possibility, the one whispered through generations of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mystics alike. That before the Babylonians reached the inner sanctum, the Ark had already been removed. That someone had seen the writing on the wall and spirited it away to safety. Perhaps buried it in the catacombs beneath the temple. Perhaps smuggled it out through one of Jerusalem's ancient escape routes, like Hezekiah's tunnel. Perhaps entrusted it to a priestly class who were never heard from again. This theory isn't just wishful thinking. A passage in the apocryphal second book of Maccabees describes the prophet Jeremiah hiding the Ark in a cave before the invasion. He then seals the entrance and declares that its location will remain unknown until God gathers his people again. It's poetic, certainly. Symbolic, maybe. But what if it was literal? Here we stumble upon a conundrum. The Ark isn't just absent, it becomes taboo. Later texts like the Talmud almost tiptoe around it. There are passing mentions of what once was, but no solid leads. Even the Second Temple, rebuilt under Persian sponsorship decades later, contained no Ark. Its Holy of Holies stood empty. The curtain hung. The priests performed their rituals, but the seat of God was gone. Which begs the question, how does a religion go on without its most sacred object? One might say the Ark was never about the box, it was about the presence. But still, the box mattered. Its absence was so glaring that even Roman conquerors in 70 CE, who famously paraded temple loot through the streets of Rome, showed no sign of having found it either. In fact, the Ark is missing from the Arch of Titus, the triumphal monument that depicts the Roman sack of Jerusalem. You can see the menorah, the trumpets, but not the Ark. Either they never found it, or they knew better than to show it. This strange trail of non-evidence has become the Ark's most enduring feature. And here's where the more controversial interpretations creep in, ones that historians debate, theologians raise eyebrows at, and conspiracy theorists drool over. Some suggest that the Ark was too powerful to remain in public hands, that the priesthood, aware of its true nature, deliberately removed it and erased its trail. Others propose that it was hidden not for safety but for prophecy, that its reemergence was to be a sign of messianic times, that no one should touch it until heaven gave the signal. But we must also acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. For centuries after the Ark's disappearance, no king, prophet, or rabbi ever claimed to have it. That's unusual. Had it survived, had it been accessible, it would have become a political bargaining chip, a divine endorsement, or at the very least, a rumor wielded by ambitious rulers. Yet the silence holds. Curiously, fragments from other cultures begin to whisper around the edges. Egyptian Coptic texts speak of relics hidden in faraway monasteries. Islamic lore hints at sacred artifacts buried beneath Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock. Even in Ethiopian traditions, ones will soon explore, the Ark's absence becomes presence, a silence that somehow speaks. Which leads us to a question with no easy answer. How does something so central, so celebrated, so famously feared, vanish without leaving a trace? Was it hidden so well that even time itself forgot? Or was it moved again and again, its guardians bound by oaths older than the empires that rose and fell around them? You may begin to suspect reasonably that the disappearance of the Ark wasn't a fluke, that it was part of a plan. A centuries-long chain of protection, exile, and secrecy. A relay of silence passed down across generations who believed that the object they protected wasn't just holy, but dangerous. And if that's true, then someone somewhere must have picked up the trail. Someone must have followed the whispers, tunneled beneath ruins, translated the dying languages, and dared to ask the forbidden question, where did it go? Much later, those seekers would wear white mantles with red crosses. They would fight for Jerusalem, then dig beneath it. They would kneel where the temple once stood, and maybe, just maybe, touch the edge of something no man was meant to hold. But before they arrived, another legend began to rise. One far to the south. One claiming that the Ark had never stayed in Jerusalem at all. Far from Jerusalem's shattered stones and fading scrolls, there exists a place that has guarded a secret so fiercely, even its priests live and die without revealing a word. Tucked into the highlands of northern Ethiopia lies the ancient city of Axum, once the capital of a forgotten empire and now the center of one of the most extraordinary and most debated claims in religious history. Here, in a modest stone chapel behind iron bars and under constant watch, the Ark of the Covenant is said to reside. Not a replica, not a symbolic relic, the actual Ark. Gold-covered, cherubim-topped, radiating the divine presence of God, kept in darkness, guarded by a single man who is not allowed to leave its side until his death. It sounds unbelievable, and yet the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has never once wavered in this claim. According to their tradition, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia almost 3,000 years ago by Menelik I, the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon himself. The story goes that Menelik visited his father in Jerusalem, was gifted a copy of the Ark by the priests, but that his servants, recognizing the original's value, swapped it and took the real one back to Axum. Solomon reportedly wept upon discovering the switch, but allowed it, believing it to be God's will. An early example of oops becoming doctrine. This tale is preserved in a medieval Ethiopian text known as the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings. It weaves together royal bloodlines, divine destinies, and the sacred object that binds heaven and earth. According to the text, the Ark has never left Ethiopia since. It has been hidden, protected, and worshipped through wars, famines, colonial invasions, and civil unrest. And to this day, only one man, the guardian of the Ark, is permitted to see it. Once appointed, he remains inside the compound for life. He does not speak to the public. He does not travel. He dies in obscurity, and another is chosen. Naturally, this claim has drawn the interest of archaeologists, theologians, and a suspicious number of adventurers with questionable maps. Yet no outside party has ever been allowed to examine the object. Not once. Not even during Emperor Haile Selassie's reign, when Ethiopia briefly flirted with modern openness. Requests from foreign dignitaries, researchers, and even the Vatican have all been politely but firmly denied. The message is consistent: the Ark is not a curiosity. It is a living covenant not to be disturbed. Still, the lack of verification doesn't mean the story stands alone in a vacuum. Over the centuries, numerous travelers have reported strange tales surrounding the chapel of the tablet. Glowing lights at night, thunderclaps on clear afternoons, pilgrims weeping uncontrollably in its presence. One Italian journalist in the 1940s claimed that Ethiopian monks admitted the Ark was so powerful it could not be approached for long without risk. Naturally, they also told him to leave immediately. Even more compelling is the role the Ark plays in Ethiopian religious life. Every church in the country, every single one, is required to contain a replica of the Ark called a tabot, which is never seen by laypeople. During major festivals like Timket, these replicas are paraded through the streets wrapped in cloth, led by chanting priests and dancing crowds. The energy is ecstatic, reverent. The people aren't just honoring myth, they believe it's real. Of course, not everyone is convinced. Western scholars often dismiss the Aksum claim as symbolic folklore, a way for a distant kingdom to tie itself to biblical authority. After all, the Kebra Nagast was compiled over 1,000 years after Menelik supposedly lived. There are no independent records of the Ark's departure from Jerusalem, and the idea that the Israelites, notoriously protective of their sacred objects, would allow it to be taken accidentally or otherwise, strains the limits of historical credulity. But what if that skepticism reveals more about us than it does about the story? After all, the Babylonians never documented the Ark's capture. The temple priesthood never confirmed its destruction. The second temple stood empty. Maybe the Ethiopians didn't steal the Ark, maybe they received it. Maybe amid rising political instability and prophetic warnings, the Ark was removed not by criminals, but by caretakers. And if it did make the journey down the Nile hidden in crates or disguised as tribute, Ethiopia would have made an ideal sanctuary. Isolated, mountainous, devout, powerful enough to protect the relic, but distant enough to remain off the radar of greedy empires. And here lies the open question. Why has no one tried harder to investigate? Perhaps they have. In 1936, when Mussolini's forces invaded Ethiopia, they quickly marched to Aksum. Rumors circulated that fascist agents tried to seize the Ark, or at least verify its existence. If they found anything, they never reported it. But strangely, the town's infrastructure around the church was never touched, as if something convinced them to walk away. And here's where a strange thread reemerges. During their campaigns in the Holy Land, centuries earlier, the Templars expressed deep interest in relics, especially those connected to the Ark. Yet curiously, some of their maps and symbology point not east, but south. Some even contain markings resembling the ancient kingdom of Aksum. Was it simple geographical misunderstanding, or something more deliberate? In a 14th century parchment attributed to a Templar initiate, there's a reference to a throne of light guarded by lions across the lands of incense. No name is given, no coordinates offered, but the phrase lions and incense feels eerily specific. Ethiopia, after all, is the land of the Lion of Judah, and frankincense was one of its ancient exports. If the Templars did believe the Ark had been moved, it's possible they were following its trail not just beneath Jerusalem, but beyond it. Of course, Aksum remains silent. The guardian keeps watch. The chapel's doors stay shut. and the world continues to wonder whether one of the most sacred relics in human history still rests beneath the Ethiopian sun, hidden behind stone, wrapped in darkness, humming with the secrets of empires. Imagine standing atop the Temple Mount, where the ancient stones radiate with a quiet heat, and the golden dome gleams against the sky like a mirror to heaven. Beneath your feet lies one of the most politically contested pieces of land on Earth, but also perhaps something far more elusive, something ancient, something still waiting. According to some of the most persistent theories, the Ark of the Covenant never left Jerusalem at all. It may be buried just below, entombed beneath centuries of conquest, silence, and stone. The idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. The Temple Mount is riddled with chambers, cisterns, and subterranean tunnels. These spaces weren't carved by modern archaeologists. Many predate the Second Temple itself. Some were used for water storage. Others served as ritual baths. But a few, especially the mysterious vaulted chambers beneath the mount, are of unknown origin. Unmapped, inaccessible, and strictly off-limits to almost everyone. This has created the perfect breeding ground for mystery. One of the first modern scholars to suggest the Ark might still lie beneath the mount was Sir Charles Warren, a British officer and early archaeologist, working under the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1860s. Warren was no romantic adventurer. He was precise, disciplined, almost annoyingly methodical. During his survey, he discovered a vertical shaft on the southeastern edge of the mount, now known as Warren's Shaft. It plunged deep into the bedrock, connecting to an intricate system of tunnels. Though he was forbidden from digging directly under the dome of the rock, Warren's notes hinted at sealed spaces and impenetrable passages that led somewhere. These discoveries ignited speculation. What if the Ark was sealed in one of these chambers by priests fleeing the Babylonian invasion? What if they chose the most sacred, the most hidden place possible beneath the Holy of Holies itself? It would be poetic, certainly, to hide God's throne beneath his own footstool. Later researchers, including Israeli archaeologist Leon Rittmeyer, expanded on this theory. Using historical texts and ancient floor plans, Rittmeyer proposed that the original location of the Holy of Holies sits precisely beneath the current dome. If the Ark had been buried by King Josiah or later priests, that's where it would be. Not in Ethiopia, not lost at sea, but quietly sleeping 10 or 20 meters down. This belief isn't just academic. It has inspired secret digs, midnight expeditions, and at least one full-blown political crisis. In 1981, a group of Jewish activists began covert excavations near the Mount's southwestern wall, believing they were close to discovering the Ark. The resulting tension nearly sparked a war. The dig was halted, the tunnels sealed. Even today, access beneath the Mount is heavily restricted. Not by historical disinterest, but by the fear of what might happen if something actually were found. And that leads us to a peculiar detail, one easy to overlook, unless you're paying very close attention. In some early Templar manuscripts, maps of Jerusalem include an odd marking beneath the temple area. A symbol, neither cross nor crown, but a golden square flanked by wings. The only other place this symbol appears is in a marginal note beside the Latin phrase, Arca Caeli, or Ark of Heaven. It may mean nothing. A doodle, perhaps. Or it may be a trace of something much older than the Templars themselves. Yet we must tread carefully here. While the theory of a buried Ark is tantalizing, it comes with limitations. Archaeological access is so restricted, and modern politics so volatile, that even the most determined researchers can't fully explore the possibilities. Ground-penetrating radar has been proposed, but denied. Excavation permits are non-existent. Even questions about the area are sometimes met with silence. That silence in itself is a form of response. Still, the legends persist. Muslim tradition speaks of relics buried deep within the mount. Jewish mystics have long whispered of the chambers of fire beneath Jerusalem, and one Crusader account often dismissed, but never fully debunked, describes Templar knights returning from the east, with knowledge not of a location, but of a pathway. A way to descend safely through the darkness. A way to find the source of the flame. That phrase, source of the flame, has baffled translators. Some see it as poetic metaphor. Others think it refers to a literal light aglow said to emit from the ark when it was active. If so, then the object wasn't just hidden, it was sealed away because it couldn't be destroyed. It had to be contained. Which leads to a subtle but haunting question. What if the ark isn't lost? What if it was never meant to be found? What if the veil over the Holy of Holies wasn't just ceremonial, but permanent? Here's where the narrative begins to twist. For centuries, the Temple Mount remained dormant. Even as new empires came and went, few dared to dig. And then, in the 12th century, a peculiar group of men arrived in Jerusalem. They were knights, but they didn't immediately go to war. They set up headquarters on the Temple Mount, not in a church or palace, but in a converted mosque. They claimed to be protecting pilgrims, but they spent years doing something else entirely. They dug, quietly, systematically, with a kind of obsession that didn't match their stated mission. What were they looking for? Treasure scripture? Or perhaps something they already suspected lay buried there, something ancient, sacred, and powerful. One obscure chronicle from a Cistercian monk describes the early Templars not as warriors, but as the brethren who mine the past. It's an odd phrase. Not theological, not martial, but archaeological. The modern reader might shrug it off. A poetic flourish, a medieval exaggeration. But the timeline doesn't lie. The first 9 Templars spent nearly 9 years in Jerusalem, without recruiting new members, without major military victories, and without building any visible infrastructure. And when they finally emerged, they were different. Wealthier, more connected, more dangerous. Some say they found documents. Others say they found relics. But one theory, the quiet one, the one spoken behind closed doors, says they found the ark, or at least the chamber where it once sat. And if so, they didn't remove it. They sealed it again, hid it beneath stone and symbol and silence. Because some things once touched are better left buried. The year was 1119. Jerusalem, bruised and scorched from centuries of war, now rested under Crusader control. The First Crusade had ended 2 decades earlier in blood-soaked triumph, and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was establishing itself as more than a military outpost. It was becoming a spiritual fortress. And within this fragile moment of rebuilding, a small band of knights arrived not as conquerors, but as pilgrims. They claimed no land, held no banners of power. Yet within a generation, they would become the most feared and enigmatic order in Europe. Their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. You know them better as the Knights Templar. But their first years were curious, quiet in the loudest of ways. While other knights took up arms or administration, these 9 men, led by Hugues de Payan, did something altogether different. They requested residence not in a castle or fortress, but on the southern edge of the Temple Mount, in a structure once believed to be the former Al-Aqsa Mosque. To the Crusaders, it was simply called the Temple of Solomon. And the Templars weren't just living there, they were digging. That's not poetic exaggeration. Chroniclers from the era, including the often cryptic William of Tyre, note that the Templars conducted searches beneath the temple platform. What they were looking for was never officially recorded. But modern scholars, peering through fragmented manuscripts and architectural inconsistencies, have identified several tunnels beneath the complex that may have been excavated during this exact time. It's tempting to wave this off as the eccentric curiosity of Crusader-age monks. But if you read between the lines, or rather beneath them, something more methodical begins to emerge. These weren't aimless digs. They were architectural autopsies. The Templars had taken up residence on the holiest site in Judaism and Islam, and instead of converting it into a grand cathedral, they quietly mapped its underworld. Some even suggest they brought plans, ancient blueprints inherited from Eastern Christian sects, or gleaned from secretive Jewish communities who had preserved oral traditions about hidden chambers under the mount. Here's where the whispers begin to crescendo. According to a 13th-century Arabic manuscript found in Cairo, a group of Frankish knights were seen removing crates wrapped in crimson cloth from beneath the mount under heavy guard late at night. The author dismisses it as superstition, but the detail about the cloth is telling. Crimson was the Templars' ceremonial color, symbolizing both martyrdom and divine authority. Covering something sacred or dangerous with red was consistent with their rites. Then there's the curious tale of the Templar pillar, a now destroyed feature in the dome of the rock's foundation, which some medieval visitors claimed had been chiseled and sealed by the knights themselves. Again, no records, no explanations, just silence. So why the digging? What were 9 men, few in number but fanatical in purpose, searching for beneath the stones of Solomon's temple? The standard narrative is protection. They were safeguarding pilgrims along the dangerous road to Jerusalem. But history disagrees. For the first 9 years of their existence, there's no record of the Templars engaging in combat. None. No skirmishes, no patrols, no heroic tales. Instead, they remained largely in Jerusalem. Stationed, focused, unusually quiet. One later account, written by a German mystic, claims the early Templars believed a vessel of flame lay buried beneath their feet. That phrase, again, flame. Not gold, not scripture. Flame. Whether symbolic or literal, it points to something beyond treasure, something closer to power. And if you think this all sounds far too cinematic, consider what happened next. In 1129, after years of obscurity, the Templars were officially endorsed by the Church at the Council of Troyes. The order exploded in size, wealth, and influence. Within a decade, they controlled properties across Europe, minted their own currency, and advised kings. From 9 obscure men to international banking powerhouses in less than 20 years, without any obvious source of wealth. Unless, of course, they brought something back. This meteoric rise did not go unnoticed. Whispers began to circulate that the Templars had discovered secrets beneath the Temple Mount relic scrolls, and yes, possibly the Ark itself. One particularly odd accusation recorded during the later Inquisition claimed that the Templars worshipped a head glowing with light, speaking in tongues, and bringing fortune in battle. Most dismissed this as political slander, but to some it sounded uncomfortably close to ancient descriptions of the Ark's presence. A particularly obscure text in the Vatican archives, known only through secondary references, describes a group of Eastern Christian monks warning crusaders not to disturb the sleeping box of thunder beneath the sacred threshold. Again, no specific naming. But if you've ever read a biblical description of the Ark, thunderous voices, destructive bursts, sudden death, it doesn't take much imagination to make the connection. So perhaps the Templars weren't just housing themselves atop the Temple Mount. Perhaps they were positioned there quite deliberately to find what had been hidden when Jerusalem fell. Maybe they believed they were chosen to retrieve it, to guard it, or more radically, to harness it. And if they found it or something close, they wouldn't have broadcast it. They wouldn't have paraded it through the streets. They would have hidden it again just as it had been hidden before, moved it, protected it, disappeared it into the folds of their growing empire. And they may have left behind more than just silence. Carvings from later Templar sites in Europe, Chartres, Tamar, and even Rosslyn contain symbols eerily reminiscent of arc imagery, cherubim, golden chests, radiating lines of energy. Some researchers believe these weren't decorative. They were directional, clues, warnings, or perhaps invitations for those who already knew. And so the trail begins. From a band of monks digging beneath a ruined temple to a global brotherhood with secrets too dangerous to reveal. They were knights sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. Warriors who prayed like monks and fought like lions. And yet behind their stoic faces and red-cross tunics, rumors began to creep like vines through stone. Whispers, fragments, tales that didn't belong to any official chronicle. The Templars, it was said, possessed something ancient, something holy, and something dangerous. No one knows exactly when the murmurs began, but by the mid-12th century, they were impossible to ignore. Chroniclers in Europe started reporting strange behavior, Templars who never lost in battle, who marched with an eerie calm, who carried banners unlike any other order, white with red, yes, but also black with unfamiliar symbols. One particularly unsettling account from a Moorish general described how a squad of Templars held an entire battalion at bay in silence, no chants, no cries, just a formation that moved as if guided by an unseen voice. It might sound like battlefield bravado, but the pattern is hard to dismiss. The Templars fought with a kind of discipline that went beyond military training. Some believed they had relics that granted protection or vision. Others insisted they used coded chants derived from ancient Hebrew texts. And in the shadows behind monastery walls, a more specific rumor took hold: the knights had found the Ark of the Covenant, or something that behaved like it. One of the earliest hints appears in the Chronicon Ex Chronicis, a historical work by Florence of Worcester. The monk offhandedly notes that some among the warrior monks have begun to speak of the object of light which they do not name. It's a blink-and-you-miss-it mention, but modern scholars believe object of light may be a sanitized reference to a relic they dared not describe aloud. Then there's the testimony of a 13th-century Syrian scribe who wrote that the Templars housed a box of gold which hummed like bees and shook the ground when uncovered. Again, too dramatic to be taken literally, unless it isn't. After all, the Ark, according to the Book of Samuel, once caused an entire Philistine town to be struck with afflictions just by being nearby. Biblical exaggeration, maybe, but multiple sources describing vibration sound and strange emanations from a box should at least raise an eyebrow. More peculiar still is how the Templars treated certain sites. At several of their commanderies, including ones in France, England, and the Iberian Peninsula, they constructed underground vaults that served no obvious purpose. These weren't wine cellars or chapels. They were sealed rooms, sometimes circular, sometimes rectangular, with no entrances except through narrow spiral staircases and thick iron-barred doors. What were they storing down there? What needed to be both protected and contained? Templar rituals became a subject of intense speculation, especially as the order's power grew. During their eventual downfall, inquisitors accused them of heretical practices, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and conducting midnight ceremonies. Most historians agree these charges were largely fabricated, cooked up by King Philip IV of France to justify seizing their wealth. But within the absurdity, there may be a sliver of something else. One accusation stood out from the rest, that the Templars worshipped a severed head, one that spoke, glowed, and gave them knowledge. This grotesque image, later known as Baphomet, has become twisted beyond recognition by modern pop culture. But if we set aside the caricatures, a disturbing echo remains. A golden object, a face, a voice. Power that radiates, speaks, and punishes. Sound familiar. Could this head have been a misunderstood interpretation of the cherubim atop the ark? To someone unfamiliar with Jewish iconography, the paired angelic figures might easily be mistaken for a disembodied, radiant face. And if the ark was ever opened briefly in secret, the display would have been terrifying enough to birth 100 legends. But here's where it becomes harder to dismiss. At several Templar sites, particularly in southern France, symbols of paired wings or twin guardians appear in frescoes and carvings subtly tucked into religious iconography. In one now-lost chapel near Carcassonne, travelers in the 18th century described a depiction of two angels holding a rectangular box between them, with lines of light shooting outward. No inscription, no context. Just that one image, eerily specific, hauntingly familiar. It's no surprise, then, that as the Templars grew richer, more powerful, and more secretive, fear followed them. Not just political fear, but something deeper. A sense that they knew something no one else did. That they carried with them not just relics, but truths. Forbidden truths. Dangerous truths. And yet, for all the suspicion, they maintained an image of divine service. Publicly pious, ruthlessly efficient, and fiercely loyal to the Church, at least on paper. But privately, they seemed to operate with a different script, a hidden knowledge, and maybe even a hidden weapon. By the late 1200s, the order was at its peak. Its members controlled fortresses from the Levant to the Atlantic. They could issue letters of credit, move armies, and speak in code. But beneath it all, the whispers grew louder. Something had been found. Something sacred, and not all the Templars agreed on what to do with it. According to one now-lost confession, its only record surviving through a later bishop's notes, a senior Templar reportedly claimed that the object had brought light and then silence. Another described a vault in which none who were afraid could enter. If these accounts are even partially accurate, they suggest the Templars weren't merely guarding a relic. They were trying to understand it, maybe even contain it. And if that's true, then the Ark, or something like it, wasn't just a prize. It was a burden, a sacred weight, a mystery not meant to be resolved but to be endured. And just as they may have begun to unlock its secrets, the tide turned. Storm clouds gathered. Kings grew jealous. The Church began to shift. And the greatest military religious order in Christendom began to crumble. But before it all came crashing down, something else happened. A series of decisions that would change the game forever. Because someone, perhaps many, realized the Ark, or the knowledge of it, could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. Which brings us to the 9 original knights, and why they may not have been chosen for war at all. They began as 9. Just 9 men in a city teeming with danger and opportunity. Jerusalem, newly captured by the Crusaders, had become a beacon for pilgrims and soldiers alike. But in 1119, when Hugues de Payens and 8 companions arrived, they didn't come with swords raised or armies behind them. They came with a request to serve, to protect travelers, to guard the roads. On the surface, it sounds noble, straightforward. A few good knights offering to shield vulnerable pilgrims from the ambushes and raids that plagued the Holy Land. And yet, when you look closely, uncomfortably closely, things don't add up. 9 knights. No reinforcements, no financial backing, no significant military activity for nearly a decade. During that entire time, they recruited no one, fought no battles of record, and remained stationed on the Temple Mount, not outside it, on top of it, in quarters granted by King Baldwin II himself, and not just any quarters directly above the ruins of Solomon's Temple. You're meant to believe these 9 men were essentially traffic cops for holy tourists. But then you remember that medieval roads were patrolled by hundreds of soldiers. Entire garrisons protected trade routes. 9 knights weren't even enough to escort a noblewoman across town, let alone protect caravans of pilgrims through the desert. So what exactly were they doing? Some historians will tell you they were laying groundwork, establishing the order, gaining credibility, preparing to scale. That's the polite answer, the safe answer. But others have whispered a different theory. For centuries, they weren't defending pilgrims. They were excavating. Consider their location. The Temple Mount wasn't a scenic overlook. It was a buried monument. Beneath its platform lay tunnels, vaults, water channels, and storage chambers dating back to the time of Solomon, and even earlier. Jewish tradition spoke of the Ark being hidden before the Babylonian destruction of the First Temple. Some believed it was sealed in a chamber directly beneath the Holy of Holies, where no one dared dig until the Crusaders arrived and gave a certain order free rein to do just that. It's easy to dismiss this as legend, until you find the architectural inconsistencies. Modern studies of the Temple Mount's substructures compiled from 19th-century surveys, old Crusader maps, and Ottoman records suggest that during the early 1100s, certain chambers were cleared or altered. Masonry shifted. Stones bearing Templar insignias were later found in places that made no structural sense. Someone had been down there, and they left just enough of a fingerprint to prove it. The question becomes, what were they looking for, and who told them it was there? Here's where the story bends towards something stranger. Several of the original 9 knightsmen, like Godfrey de Saint-Omer and André de Montbard, had connections to esoteric Christian sects in southern France, families that had preserved oral traditions dating back to the Visigoths and early Gnostics. Legends of a sacred object buried beneath Jerusalem, a vessel of divine communication, a throne of God. The descriptions shift, but the implication is clear: the Ark. Some modern researchers believe these families held not just stories, but maps. Ancient diagrams, perhaps even templated from Jewish mystical sources, or apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch. According to one theory, the knights had access to a key, not literal, but conceptual. A code for unlocking the hidden chambers beneath the mount. Their mission wasn't defensive, it was archaeological, and their silence was strategic. For nearly a decade, the Templars said little and wrote less. There are no surviving records from their earliest years. No chronicles, no letters, no rules. Just a void. A quiet where there should have been noise. And when they finally emerged into public view, endorsed by Bernard of Clairvaux and embraced by the papacy, they were transformed. No longer obscure monks, now holy warriors, political operators, keepers of secrets. The timing is too perfect to ignore. What could have catalyzed this rise? How do 9 relatively unknown knights suddenly wield the favor of kings and popes, unless they returned from beneath the mount not with rumors, but with proof? One tantalizing clue comes from a later 12th century letter attributed to a Cistercian abbot. In it, the abbot praises the Templars for preserving that which sanctified the first tabernacle. He doesn't say what that is, but the phrasing is unmistakably tied to Ark-related passages in the Book of Exodus. Scholars argue about the letter's authenticity, of course. But the language is precise, almost liturgical, not something easily invented. Then, there's the case of the Seal of Solomon, a motif that began to appear in Templar sites long before it became popular in Western heraldry. The six-pointed star, now commonly associated with Judaism, was in medieval Christian mysticism linked to divine wisdom and sacred geometry. In Templar usage, it wasn't merely decorative, it was functional. Some believed the star was a cipher, a symbolic map of intersecting forces possibly connected to the ark's resting place. Even more curious is the silence of the church during this period. Normally, any unsanctioned excavation near a holy site would draw ecclesiastical ire, but the Templars operated with unusual freedom. Did someone in Rome already know or at least suspect what lay beneath? Did they approve the mission quietly under the veil of papal authority? These questions remain open, but the deeper you go, the more deliberate the mystery seems. 9 nights, 9 years, one site, one object. It's tempting to view this as myth-making. But if it were just a story, you'd expect embellishment songs, relics, pilgrimages. Instead, you get shadows, vaults sealed again, symbols carved and half erased, knowledge gained then hidden, as if the goal was never to possess the Ark, just to find it, and then make it disappear again. Because some relics aren't meant to be shown, some truths aren't meant to be spoken, and the ones who guard them are trained to say nothing at all. In the dry caves near Qumran, the desert air doesn't just preserve artifacts, it mummifies secrets. And among the thousands of fragments found in the Dead Sea scrolls, one stands apart. Not for its theology or poetry, but for its material. While the others were written on parchment or papyrus, this one was etched into sheets of copper. Cold, durable, unmistakably intentional. Its language is matter of fact, its contents a treasure map. Discovered in Cave 3 in 1952, the Copper Scroll is unlike any other Dead Sea document. It doesn't preach, instruct, or reflect. It lists 64 locations, weights, measures, distances in the ruin that is in the valley of Achor under the steps leading to the east, and so on. What is being described is no metaphor. The scroll reads like an inventory. Gold, silver, temple vessels, ritual objects, buried caches of immense value. And then curiously, there's mention of the vessels of the sanctuary and the sacred implements of the house. Some have interpreted this as mundane priestly equipment, but others more daring have suggested the language implies something greater. One line references a third chamber near a specific spring in which the scroll and the oil and the container of the command are hidden. That last phrase, container of the command, has haunted researchers for decades. Because the Ark of the Covenant was known in some texts as the Aron Hayadut, the Ark of the Testimony, the container of the law, or more pointedly, the container of the command. Could this scroll, rusted and curled like a bronze serpent, contain directions to the Ark itself? Most scholars hesitate to go that far. The Copper Scroll, they argue, is part of a larger Essene horde, a community known for its apocalyptic theology and intense secrecy. There's no evidence, they say, that the Essenes ever had access to the Ark. But here's the thing. There's also no evidence that they didn't. And given the Ark's disappearance long before the scroll's estimated origin, one has to ask, where were they getting their information? There are curious overlaps. The scroll describes sites in and around Jerusalem, including areas beneath the Temple Mount and near the Valley of Achor, places associated in oral tradition with refuge and hiding. It's also notable that the scroll contains deliberate contradictions. Some instructions are incomplete. Others refer to landmarks that no longer exist, as if the scroll wasn't meant for just anyone, as if you needed a separate key to decode it. And here's where the Templars return to the stage. In the 12th century, a Templar scriptorium in southern France produced a strange document since lost, but mentioned in two separate inquisitorial records. It was called De Tabula Sacrorum, the Table of the Holy Things. A list of items, some ritual, some financial, all categorized with symbols rather than words. One column, rarely discussed, featured a diagram resembling the ancient Hebrew letter shin, flanked by dots and lines. The label beside it, Regula Testamenti, the rule of the testament. There's no proof this list connects to the copper scroll, but the structure is strikingly similar. Coded inventory, numerical values, geographic markers. More tantalizing still is a surviving footnote from a 14th century Cistercian chronicler who writes, "The Knights of the Temple were not only guardians of men, but of maps and metals. Treasures not of this age, but of the temple of the Lord." So if the Templars had access to ancient knowledge texts, perhaps even the copper scroll itself, or a copy, they would have had both the motivation and means to follow it. Their early years in Jerusalem coincide almost eerily with the areas described in the scroll, and if the Ark were ever buried under a site marked in that list, the only way to find it would be through digging secrecy and a complete absence of recorded activity. Sound familiar? There's also the question of language. The copper scroll is written in a form of Mishnaic Hebrew, but with strange anomalies, Aramaic influences, unusual spellings, and coded spacing. Some linguists believe the scroll was intentionally booby-trapped to mislead outsiders. But what if someone cracked it? Some theories propose that a now-lost sect of Karaite Jews, strict adherents to the Hebrew Bible, preserved oral interpretations of the scroll's riddles. And during the Crusades, it's not unthinkable that these teachings could have been shared, even sold, to a group with enough coin and enough conviction to follow the trail. A group like the Templars. A final detail. In 1992, an Israeli team conducting a non-invasive survey of underground structures beneath Jerusalem's ancient walls detected a chamber. Rectangular, dry, undisturbed. It matched one of the copper scroll's described measurements, though the location was never officially released. Funding ran out. Political tensions surged. The project dissolved. The chamber remains unexcavated. And so the copper scroll sits in a museum in Jordan, twisted and oxidized, its text still incomplete. But its echoes continue to resonate not as a treasure map for gold, but as a ghost trail. One that stretches across centuries, across empires, and straight into the vaults once guarded by men who never spoke of what they found. Did the Templars locate one of the copper scroll's caches? Did they retrieve ritual objects? Did they touch the edge of the Ark's final resting place? The evidence remains circumstantial, but the patterns, the timing, and the silence, they're hard to ignore. And if the scroll was real, if the cache was real, then perhaps hidden beneath symbols and stone one final chest still rests in the dark, waiting. Far from the arid dust of Jerusalem, amid the gentle hills and whispering plains of northern France, rises a cathedral that seems to glow from within. Chartres, a monument of stone and glass, so precise, so mystical, that some say it was not built, it was revealed. To visit it is to step into a symphony of silence and symmetry, where shadows fall like prayers, and every column seems to hum with hidden meaning. But beneath its sacred stillness lies an even stranger suggestion that the Ark of the Covenant may have been here, or at the very least remembered here, with shocking clarity. Completed in the early 13th century, Chartres Cathedral is famous for many things, Its radiant blue stained glass, its asymmetrical towers, its miraculous survival through wars and revolutions. But to those who study sacred geometry, Templar lore, and the esoteric whispers of medieval architecture, Chartres is something else entirely. A codex in stone, a map, a vault of encoded knowledge. Let's begin with the timeline. The cathedral's reconstruction began in 1194, just decades after the Templars' supposed excavations beneath the Temple Mount. At the same time, Templar influence in France was exploding. Donations poured in. Land was granted. And some of that land curiously surrounded Chartres. While the Templars didn't officially oversee the cathedral's construction, their fingerprints are everywhere. Knights from the order were closely tied to the Bishop of Chartres. Their symbols, crosses, circles, dual guardians appear subtly in carvings, capitals, and floor mosaics. Not declarations, but echoes. Then there's the art. In one of the cathedral's south transept windows is a stained glass panel depicting the Ark. Not just a vague box with wings. No, this is the real deal, gold-topped, flanked by cherubim, carried by rods, surrounded by glowing light. The detail is astonishing, especially for a European cathedral far removed from the Middle Eastern deserts, where the Ark supposedly vanished centuries earlier. Why include this? Why here? It's the only major medieval cathedral in France to feature such an explicit image of the Ark. And it doesn't stop there. Beneath the cathedral lies a crypt, one of the largest in France. Some of its passages follow no architectural logic. Dead ends, twisting tunnels, chambers that serve no liturgical purpose. Some theorists believe these were meant to confuse, to protect, or perhaps to preserve something older than the church itself. The crypt was built atop a pre-Christian site long held sacred by Druids. And here's where it gets peculiar. An old legend passed down through local monastic records claims that before the cathedral was rebuilt, a mysterious group of men visited the site. They weren't monks, they weren't nobles. They wore white, bore no weapons, and spoke Latin with an Eastern accent. They stayed only a few weeks. When they left, they made no donation, asked for no favor. But shortly after construction began on the new cathedral, with astonishing speed and mathematical precision. Some believe these men were Templars. Others say they were emissaries from an even older sect, guardians of a relic that had to be hidden not in the deserts of the East, but beneath the stones of the West. Now, of course, skeptics will argue there's no record, no document, no proof. And they're right. But Chartres is a place of signs, not statements. Consider the labyrinth. Etched into the cathedral's floor is a massive 11-circuit labyrinth. Pilgrims walked it on their knees, tracing a symbolic path to salvation. But from above, it looks suspiciously like a circuit diagram, coiled, energy-mirrored patterns, a flow toward a central point. Some have called it a map of the human soul. Others think it's something far more practical, a blueprint. A symbolic echo of the Ark's own design. A pattern of the heavens as described in Exodus. A code. And if you still think this is overreach, let's return to the building itself. Chartres is aligned not only with solstices, but with a star spica in the constellation Virgo. On specific days, light pierces the stained glass in patterns that trace geometric shapes across the floor. Shapes that match sacred diagrams found in early Templar manuscripts, Vesica Piscis hexagrams, the Seal of Solomon. This is not coincidence. This is intent. So what does it mean? Did the Templars hide the Ark beneath Chartres? Unlikely. The crypt has been explored. No golden chest, no glowing box. But perhaps they didn't bring the Ark itself. Perhaps they brought its design, its proportions, its meaning. Or perhaps they brought something more abstract, a relic too dangerous to keep in the East, wrapped not in cloth, but in geometry. Some believe the cathedral itself is the Ark, not metaphorically, but mathematically. A container of sacred ratios, aligned with the stars, built to hold divine presence. A massive, immovable reliquary. A statement in stone that says we found it, and we cannot speak of it, but we have not forgotten. One final detail. In a lesser-known side chapel, there's a carving of Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king of Salem. He holds a vessel shaped like a box flanked by angels. The Latin inscription reads, Sacramentum Dei in terra, the mystery of God on earth. It's a whisper, a clue. Because maybe the Ark was never meant to be lifted again. Maybe it was meant to be translated, from box to building, from relic to riddle. And at Chartres, the riddle still waits humming beneath stained glass and shadows. It began on a Friday, October 13th, 1307, an ordinary autumn morning that would forever stain the number 13 with whispers of bad luck. Across France, before sunrise, a coordinated operation was already in motion. Royal messengers galloped through fog-drenched roads, scrolls sealed with the king's own signet clenched tightly in their fists. By the end of the day, hundreds of Knights Templar would be chained, silenced, and condemned. Their assets seized, their secrets demanded, their order undone. Officially, the charges were heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, kissing of obscure body parts, and in one particularly dramatic twist, communion with a glowing head that whispered prophecies in the dark. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but the absurdity was the point. Philip IV of France, nicknamed Philip the Fair, though there was nothing fair about him, was desperate. Drowning in debt from wars and poor governance, he had turned to the Templars for loans, repeatedly, and when they refused to forgive them, he did what any panicked monarch with too many enemies and not enough gold might do. He manufactured a reason to destroy his creditors. But here's the twist. While the charges may have been fabricated, the reaction they provoked suggests something deeper was at play. The sheer scope of the operation, coordinated arrests across multiple cities conducted with secrecy and speed, was unlike anything Europe had seen. It was a purge disguised as justice, a surgical strike on an order too powerful to leave alone, and possibly in possession of something too dangerous to let survive. Because what Philip really wanted wasn't repentance. It was whatever the Templars were hiding. Interrogation transcripts, carefully preserved in Vatican vaults and now partially declassified, reveal a strange pattern. Again and again, the inquisitors returned to one subject, the mysterious object said to be kept in the possession of the Grand Master. They didn't ask about the poor or the Crusades. They asked about the thing. What was it? Where was it kept? Did it glow? Did it speak? One knight under torture described an arc of brightness that could not be opened without prayer. Another mentioned a black box inlaid with gold, kept in a vault only the masters could enter. Yet no vault was ever found, no box recovered. And when Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in 1314, he said nothing about treasure or relics, only that he was innocent and that the king and pope would soon face judgment. They both died within a year. Coincidence, maybe. But it's hard to ignore the pattern. In the months leading up to the arrest, multiple Templar strongholds reportedly moved artifacts, documents, and ships out of France. Some went south toward Aragon and Portugal. Others disappeared into the night, never seen again. Most famously, the fleet at La Rochelle, dozens of Templar ships vanished. No battle, no wreckage, no survivors. They simply sailed away. It's possible they were evacuating gold. More likely they were evacuating knowledge, or something that knowledge protected. And then there's the matter of the papacy. Pope Clement V, a puppet of Philip IV, reluctantly signed off on the arrests. But before the ink dried, he began distancing himself. Letters reveal his hesitation, his belief that the confessions were unreliable. In secret, he even ordered some Templar documents to be sealed rather than destroyed. Why, what did he suspect? A recently uncovered fragment in the Vatican secret archives, known only as the Chignon parchment, confirms that the Church privately absolved the Templars of heresy, even while allowing their public condemnation. It's a contradiction so bold, it almost makes sense. Let them burn, but keep the truth buried. Because here's the thing, you don't arrest an entire order just for rumors of blasphemy. You don't torture men into confessions unless you think they're hiding something of real value. And you certainly don't coordinate an international erasure campaign unless you believe they found it. Or at least found the trail. That trail, if we believe the whispers, leads back to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, to the very foundation of the Templars' origin, and perhaps to the Ark. If they recovered it, or even part of it, it would explain the fear, the urgency, the violence. A relic that could win wars, validate prophets, or silence kings would be more dangerous than any army. But then why not use it? Here's where the silence becomes its own kind of evidence. The Templars were not just warriors. They were mystics, builders, philosophers. If they held the Ark, or even knowledge of its location, they may have chosen to protect it, not wield it, to guard humanity from itself. After all, the last time it was used carelessly, people died just for touching it. And so in 1307, the final question wasn't, did the Templars blaspheme? It was, where did they hide it? The king never found it. The church never revealed it. But something moved, something vanished. And in its absence, 1,000 legends bloomed. Somewhere between the torture racks and the sealed scrolls, a story was scrubbed clean but not quite erased. And as we follow the trail, we begin to glimpse its shadow again. Because the day before the arrests, a fleet vanished, and what they carried may have been more than treasure. It may have been the final torch in a chain of guardianship stretching back to Solomon. The port of La Rochelle once echoed with the creak of timber, the slap of ropes against sail, and the deep groan of mooring posts as ships tugged against the tide. Nestled along France's Atlantic coast, it was a vital artery for the Templar order, both a maritime hub and a treasury in disguise. Goods flowed in and out, spices, textiles, arms, coin, and things never catalogued. But on one particularly quiet night in October 1307, the harbor fell silent in a different way. Dozens of Templar ships vanished without a trace, without a witness, without a word. What happened to the fleet of La Rochelle? On the surface, the answer is frustratingly simple. We don't know. But the absence, once again, is louder than any record. When King Philip IV ordered the mass arrest of the Templars on October 13th, he expected to seize everything, men, assets, and especially archives. Yet when his men arrived at La Rochelle, the ships were gone, evaporated. No scuttling, no sabotage, just missing. The order had maintained a naval presence there for decades. They owned warehouses, coastal fortresses, and shipyards far more than what one would expect from an organization supposedly focused on land-based warfare. And those ships weren't idle. Templar vessels ran trade routes between France, England, the Levant, and even further afield. But the fleet that disappeared wasn't just trade cargo. It was something else. Something bigger. Because someone had warned them. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. The fleet vanished mere hours before the arrests began across France. Philip's orders were delivered in sealed packets to be opened and acted upon simultaneously. But somehow someone among the Templars knew it all. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable implication: the Templars had spies. High ones, possibly even inside the church. The Pope's relationship with the order had already soured. Philip's pressure on Clement V was mounting, and yet papal records show that the Templars continued to receive envoys and letters right up to the eve of the purge. Could one of those messengers have tipped them off? Could someone in Rome have known what Philip was planning, and in a final act of subversion, warned the knights? Whatever the mechanism, the result was unmistakable. The fleet departed silently into the Atlantic. And then the theories begin. One of the earliest claims came from a 14th-century Venetian merchant who swore he saw Templar-marked ships docking in Sardinia weeks after the arrests. The men aboard reportedly spoke little, traded only in gold, and asked directions to the Balearic Islands. He described them as stern and silent, as if fleeing ghosts. His account was dismissed, of course, but later that century similar rumors surfaced in Scotland, Portugal, and even Iceland. What were these ships carrying? According to one fragment found in the Larminius Charter, a document of highly questionable authenticity but rich with symbolism, the fleet transported not just gold, but sacred instruments and books of power. The phrasing is cryptic, perhaps intentionally, but for those who see a Templar trail winding through Europe's forgotten shadows, that phrase rings with familiarity. Books of power, instruments of the sacred. Could it be that the Ark, or documents relating to it, was among the cargo? And if not the Ark itself, perhaps something close. A model, a map, a relic once housed within the Ark or associated with its function. More than one researcher has pointed out that the Templars were obsessed with logistics. They weren't just fighters, they were organizers. Their commanderies were aligned in near-perfect grids across Europe. Their record-keeping was impeccable. If they had the Ark, or even believed they had found evidence of it, they would have had contingency plans. Some suggest they headed west, not to Spain or Britain, but across the Atlantic. This theory, often ridiculed but never fully buried, holds that the fleet carried its most valuable cargo to a land unclaimed, unknown, and unreachable by Philip's men. Yes, America. Long before Columbus, legends of a western land persisted in Norse, Basque, and Irish traditions. If any group could have preserved those roots, it would have been the Templars. Their ships were fast, their navigators skilled, and their motivation absolute. If they believed the Ark or any divine relic had to be hidden beyond reach of kings crossing the sea, would not have been too mad a plan. Others suggest they stayed closer. That the fleet broke into smaller squadrons, depositing artifacts in safe houses across Europe. Portugal, which never joined the Templar persecution, became a haven. There the knights were rebranded as the Order of Christ and continued to flourish, coincidentally becoming patrons of the Age of Discovery. That's not just a neat historical pivot, it's a possible through line. One thing's certain: after La Rochelle, the Ark's trail grows cold again, but not lifeless. Here and there, fragments appear. Ship logs in Spain listing anonymous vessels with no flag. Fortress designs in Scotland with inner chambers never explained. A vault in Tamar, Portugal's Templar stronghold, built with walls 2 meters thick and no clear entrance. And then there's Rosslyn. But before we get to the Scottish stone, it's worth asking, why go through all this? Why not destroy the relic or bury it forever? Because some things are not to be discarded. They are to be protected. The Ark, if it survived, would not just be a box. It would be a testimony, a covenant, a source of power, yes, but also of judgment. The kind of thing that unhinges kings, terrifies popes, and makes cautious men sail into the fog without a map. So the Templars vanished, their ships scattered, and their secrets went with them. But they left behind signs just enough for someone to follow, and the next clue lies not at sea, but in stone. Just south of Edinburgh, amid the damp green hush of the Scottish countryside, sits a chapel that seems to breathe mystery with every carved stone. Rosslyn. Its walls whisper in silence, each column wound with riddles, each arch ribbed with allegory. For centuries, the chapel has been a magnet for legends of buried treasures, bloodlines, sacred knowledge, and most enduring of all, that something lies beneath it. Something brought here by fleeing knights wrapped in silence and shadow. A sacred relic. Possibly the sacred relic. From the outside, Rosslyn Chapel doesn't shout. It hums. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, a descendant of a powerful noble house with rumored Templar ties, the chapel stands as both anomaly and echo. Anomaly because its scale and ornamentation are astonishing for a private chapel. Echo because its interior is laced with symbols that reach far beyond Christian orthodoxy, touching on Norse myth, Judaic mysticism, and yes, Templar iconography. Let's start with what's visible. On the north wall, there's a carving of two men riding a single horse, an unmistakable emblem of the Templars. But the order had been officially dissolved for over a century when this was built. Why revive the symbol? Why here, so far from the Holy Land, from Jerusalem, from La Rochelle? Unless it wasn't just nostalgia. Numerous accounts link the Sinclairs to remnants of the Templar order. During the 14th century, after the suppression, many Templars fled France and sought refuge in Scotland, then excommunicated from Rome and hostile to the French crown. Robert the Bruce, at war with England, had little reason to enforce papal edicts. The result, a safe haven. And Sinclair, he wasn't just a noble. He was grand hereditary patron of Scottish Freemasonry, an organization steeped in arcane rituals, sacred geometry, and depending on whom you ask, fragments of Templar heritage. Rosslyn Chapel is built with architectural knowledge that should not have existed in Scotland at the time. The intricate latticework, the precise astronomical alignments, the uncanny parallels with Solomon's Temple itself. The floor plan divided into nave, chancel, and crypt mirrors, the layout of the first temple in Jerusalem, according to ancient Jewish sources. Coincidence, perhaps. But let's descend further. Beneath the chapel lies a sealed vault. No one has entered it in recorded history. Sinclair family tradition insists that opening it would break a sacred trust. Ground-penetrating radar conducted in the late 20th century confirmed the presence of Void's chambers, but excavation has been repeatedly denied. Why, according to one particularly persistent legend, the vault contains artifacts brought by surviving Templars, scrolls from Solomon's Temple, the Holy Grail, and most controversially, the Ark of the Covenant. Not the original necessarily, but perhaps its remains, a fragment, a secondary vessel, or even just the blueprints. Consider the symbolism. Carved into the Lady Chapel's ceiling are hundreds of stylized stars forming constellations that some researchers claim match the sky on a particular date, September 26, the chapel's supposed dedication. But within that pattern is a central axis, one that aligns with a narrow shaft in the floor, pointing downward. A visual beam from heaven to earth, a line of divine descent. Exactly the kind of axis described in Kabbalistic texts about the Merkava, the chariot of God. Now pan to the apprentice pillar. A twisting column said to represent the tree of life, It's wrapped in spirals with dragons at its base and a curious arrangement of cube-like protrusions. Some believe the cubes form a musical code. Others say it's an encoded dimensional map. One theory suggests it mirrors the Ark's golden rods tools for transporting something that must never be touched. And then there's the legend. According to an oral account passed down through Masonic channels, the Templars who escaped with the fleet at La Rochelle brought their most sacred object to a place where the stars danced slow and the ground remembered no kings. That poetic phrase is often interpreted as Scotland independent remote and unburdened by papal chains. Could Rosslyn be that sanctuary? Possibly. But what makes the claim tantalizing is not what's found, but what's missing. No public documentation exists for the original purpose of the crypt. No inventory, no dedication, no burial. And yet it was built with extraordinary care, arched, sealed, and inaccessible from above. Like a chamber designed not to entomb, but to protect. And there's one final clue. Obscure, dusty, and almost lost to time. In 2001, a Swedish scholar analyzing architectural ratios at Rosslyn found that the proportions of the chancel echoed those described in the Book of Exodus for the ark's housing 2-to-1 dimensions, cubic resonance, spatial layering. He didn't claim it was the ark's chamber, only that it was modeled after one. A tribute or a replacement. Perhaps the ark, if it ever reached Rosslyn, was never meant to be worshipped again. Perhaps it was meant to sleep, to be surrounded not by priests or soldiers, but by stone, encrypted, encased, kept not in secrecy but in resonance, so that future generations could walk among its shadows without knowing, so that power could become memory and memory myth. And yet, it doesn't feel finished, does it? The chapel lives. It breathes. The light changes. The symbols reveal, conceal, and realign. And somewhere beneath that stone floor, a story is still whispering, waiting for someone who knows how to listen. When the hammer fell on the Templars, it struck hard, but not everywhere. In France, they burned. In England, they were gently nudged into retirement. But in Portugal, they changed their clothes, changed their name, and carried on like the fire never reached them. Welcome to the strange tale of the Order of Christ, a transformation so quiet, so efficient, and so curiously perfect that one begins to wonder, was it a rescue or a relocation? The year was 1319, just 5 years after Pope Clement V had officially dissolved the Templar order. King Denis of Portugal petitioned the Vatican for a new knightly order. His argument was that the Templars in Portugal had done no wrong, and that their wealth and lands, substantial by the way, should not go to waste. The Pope, perhaps exhausted from burning too many monks, agreed, and so with the flick of a pen, the Order of Christ was born. But here's the curious part. Many of the former Templars in Portugal were seamlessly absorbed into this new order. Same properties, same fortresses, same knights, different banner. It was the ultimate rebrand. Their headquarters moved to Tomar, a massive fortified complex that had previously been the nerve center for the Templars in Portugal. The castle, the convent, the watchtowers all stayed the same. What changed was the symbol, no longer the red cross of the temple, but a red cross with flared arms, a new emblem, but one that still echoed its predecessor like a faded echo in stone. Tomar was no ordinary fortress. The structure included strange architectural features, octagonal rotundas, symbolic carvings, secret staircases, and a chapter house with proportions eerily similar to the Dome of the Rock. Historians often brush this off as stylistic flair, but to others it signals something deeper, a continuation of a tradition born beneath Jerusalem. a place that once possibly sheltered the Ark. Could it be that what the Templars may have discovered in the east fragments of the Ark, or knowledge of its location, was brought west not just to hide, but to protect? And could Portugal, a remote kingdom on the edge of Christendom, have been chosen as the new sanctuary? There's more. In the centuries that followed, the Order of Christ didn't fade into obscurity. In fact, it flourished. They funded and directed many of the great voyages of the Age of Discovery. Henry the Navigator himself, a Grand Master of the Order, wore its cross on his sails. Vasco da Gama, Pedro Alvarez Cabral. The great seafarers who stitched together the first global maps all bore that same symbol. Not a coincidence. Some suggest that this new role as sponsors of exploration wasn't just about empire. It was about knowledge. That the Order of Christ was following ancient routes, perhaps encoded in the old Templar archives. That they weren't just seeking spices or gold, but something else. Something whispered in scrolls, perhaps sketched in the margins of maps. A trail, a relic, a legend made portable. Templar records from Tomar are scarce, but one account written decades after the transition describes an inner sanctum where only the Grand Master and select brothers were permitted. The room, it says, was circular, windowless, and shielded by 3 doors. Nothing was stored there officially, and yet it was always guarded. Some believe it held texts, others say a relic, a box, a replica, or perhaps the original. There's also the tale of the mirror stone, a slab in the Tomar convent, that allegedly reflects no light. According to one 16th century visitor, it absorbs the flame like darkness that remembers. The phrase sounds poetic, but it's a strange thing to say about a rock. Unless the metaphor wasn't metaphor. Unless the darkness remembered something real, something radiant. Skeptics, of course, scoff. They argue that the Order of Christ was a political solution, not a mystical one. That the Ark, if it ever existed, had long vanished. But what they can't explain is the continuity, the smoothness, the way the Templar spirit, knowledge, and wealth passed into a new body without resistance. No other suppressed order managed that trick. Only the Templars in Portugal. And there's a reason King Denis was able to make it happen. He was deeply interested in science, architecture, and ancient texts. He personally oversaw the construction of libraries and sponsored the translation of Arabic manuscripts. A king obsessed with hidden knowledge just happened to protect the only surviving branch of the Templars. That's a suspicious amount of symmetry. More hauntingly, during the Portuguese Inquisition, centuries later, records were uncovered of men being interrogated about an object described as the voice of God locked in gold. The descriptions were vague, the charges were buried, but the phrase lingers, locked in gold, voice of God. Sound familiar? If the Ark had survived and if it had passed into the hands of a group determined to keep it hidden while also protecting its knowledge, Portugal would have been the perfect place. Isolated, independent. Out of the reach of both French kings and Roman popes, a western frontier with eastern memory. And the Templars, now the Order of Christ, sailed from there. Westward, farther and farther, always seeking, or carrying, or both. Perhaps they found something. Perhaps they hid it. But either way, the knowledge they once guarded didn't die. It changed uniforms. Off the coast of Nova Scotia lies an island shrouded in fog and frustration, where pits fill themselves, treasure refuses to surface, and stories have outlived excavators. Oak Island, a place where legend, engineering, and obsession have entwined into one of the strangest archaeological mysteries in North America. Some say the island hides pirate gold. Others claim it's a hoax. But then there's the more radical theory, quietly persistent and never entirely debunked, that what's buried on Oak Island is not treasure in the usual sense. It's something older, something sacred, and possibly Templar. The story begins in 1795 when a teenage boy named Daniel McGinnis noticed a strange depression in the ground beneath a crooked oak. Curious, he and two friends began digging. A few feet down, they struck a layer of stone, then logs, then more soil, then logs again. Every 10 feet, a new platform, as if the ground itself were protecting something below. And so began the dig that never ended. Over the centuries, excavators, many of them funded by millionaires, Freemasons and conspiracy theorists, have tunneled, drilled, flooded, and collapsed their way across the island. They've found wooden structures deep underground, strange stone markers with symbols no one can quite translate, and fragments of parchment, bone, and metal. But no jackpot, no vault, just clues, teasers, and water, always the water. The so-called money pit has defeated every attempt to drain it, as if the island itself were guarding its secret. Now here's where things get eerie. In the 19th century, a stone was reportedly found inscribed with symbols translated as 40 feet below 2 million pounds lie buried. The stone later vanished. But the excitement didn't. More strange artifacts surfaced: a medieval cross, a lead Templar coin, a Roman sword, though likely a forgery, and most controversially, traces of coconut fiber not native to the region packed deep into the earth. Why is that significant? Because coconut fiber was often used by Mediterranean and Near Eastern sailors to insulate cargo and line water filtration systems. Its presence suggests someone came from far away before Columbus, before Cabot, and they came prepared. Then there's the triangle-shaped swamp. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have revealed that the island may have once been two islands artificially joined by humans to form a hidden chamber between them. That kind of engineering takes planning and purpose. So the question becomes, who had both the motive and the means to bury something of enormous value on a remote Canadian island centuries before mainstream colonization enter the Templars again? It sounds wild, until you remember the missing fleet at La Rochelle. Ships that vanished without a trace in the hours before the French crackdown. Ships that could have sailed anywhere. West, perhaps. Following maps known only to them, sailing not with armies, but with cargo. Something too sacred to leave in the hands of kings or popes. Nova Scotia was in theory reachable. Viking sagas hinted at land west of Greenland. Basque fishermen later operated in those waters. And some Templar documents refer cryptically to lands beyond the setting sun. Just romantic poetry, maybe. But what if it was something more? Several researchers believe the layout of Oak Island's structures mirrors sacred geometry found in Templar churches, particularly the distances between landmarks and the way they form equilateral triangles. Others point to the existence of a lead cross found in the island's swamp, eerily similar to ones worn by 13th century Templar initiates. And one particularly daring theory suggests that the pit isn't a pit at all, it's a decoy. That the real vault lies elsewhere on the island, untouched, unsearched, and disguised. What could be hidden there? Not gold doubloons, not stolen gems, but knowledge, artifacts, relics, possibly even the Ark or a piece of it. Or perhaps just the tools and scrolls describing it. A coded collection, a mobile archive of sacred things, because the Templars were not just warriors, they were curators, and if they knew the Ark could never be revealed again, not without upending civilization, they would have hidden it somewhere impossible to stumble upon, somewhere disconnected from crusades and empires, somewhere new, a new world. And if that's true, it would explain the failure, the frustration, the infinite layers of interference. Not because it was a trap, but because it was never meant to be opened again. Not by anyone but the guardians themselves, and still the island breathes, the trees creak, the swamp lies still and bottomless. Excavators dig and dig and dig, but what they're looking for may not be what they're meant to find. Because perhaps it was never about the treasure, it was about the legacy, and the secret that one order tried to carry across an ocean, bury under a starless sky, and protect until the end of time. You walk the shadowed corridors of the Vatican and begin to realize something. It's not the opulence that commands awe, nor the vastness of its archives, nor the gravity of the papal throne. It's the silence, the curated, practiced, deliberate absence of answers. In a city built upon centuries of revelation and ritual, some things are kept so far from the light, they almost feel buried. And perhaps none more so than the subject of the Ark. You would think logically that the most sacred object in Judaic scripture, the Ark of the Covenant, would warrant more than a passing mention in Rome. You would expect shrines, debates, papal encyclicals, a theological museum exhibit perhaps with golden cherubim cast in replica. And yet there is nothing. No celebration, no denial, just omission, like a book with one page torn out so precisely that the edges are smooth. The Church speaks volumes about relics, bones of saints, fragments of the cross, the shroud, the spear, even the rope that allegedly bound Christ's wrists. But not the Ark, not a word, not even in whispers. And yet you sense its shape in the gaps. Take, for example, the Chinon parchment discovered only in 2001 after it had been misfiled for centuries. It revealed that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templars of heresy, even as he publicly allowed their destruction. In those yellowing Latin phrases, a strange duality emerges: a pope too weak to defend the order, but apparently unwilling to condemn them outright. Was he protecting doctrine or suppressing a greater truth? In one of Clement's lesser-known correspondences, there appears a line buried in theological pretext that speaks of those matters brought from the East, of which the brothers dare not write. No object is named, no event described. But the phrasing is unsettlingly specific. Matters brought. Knowledge kept off parchment. And what could be more dangerous to the Church than a relic that speaks for God directly? If the Templars did recover the Ark, or even part of it, it would present a terrifying problem. Because the Ark's authority bypasses Rome. It predates Christ. It belongs to a covenant outside of papal succession. The moment it reappears, every bishop, every cardinal, even the Pope himself must answer to it. Not interpret it, not enshrine it, submit to it. And the Vatican, for all its devotion, is not built to surrender power. So instead of confrontation, it turns to containment. Over the centuries, that containment has taken the form of absence. No official position, no relic hunting mission, not even a theological clarification. While men like Galileo were dragged before tribunals for charting the stars, no one is questioned for asking about the Ark, because no one is allowed to ask. But not all silences are clean. In the reorganizations of the 20th century, a Jesuit librarian working deep within the apostolic archives reportedly logged the existence of a Jerusalem inventory copied from a foreign script. He described items listed as vessels, scrolls, and a receptacle marked only as Arca. The note was redacted, the librarian reassigned. The term never appears again. Even within the Vatican's private theological schools, teachings on the Ark are strangely confined. Professors speak of it as a metaphor, an Old Testament curiosity fulfilled and replaced by the presence of Christ. But among certain monastic orders, particularly those with ties to Old Templar holdings, the Ark is spoken of differently. Not dismissed, not denied, avoided. You start to realize this is not ignorance, it is preservation. The Ark represents the one thing the Church cannot canonize, cannot bury in relic glass, cannot tie with red ribbon and Latin liturgy. It is power without mediator. It is divine fire in a golden box, and fire, if you're not prepared, burns. And then there are the rumors. One story, repeated in Masonic and Jesuit circles alike, tells of a single object sealed in the lower levels of Castel Gandolfo, not Vatican City proper, but still under papal jurisdiction. An object too dangerous to study, too sacred to destroy. Always guarded, never displayed. The story's vague, no details, but the phrase used is always the same, a covenant that speaks only in silence. If it's just a story, it's an oddly consistent one. If it's not, then maybe the Ark was never truly lost. Maybe it was found, protected, buried again, not in the sands of Jerusalem or beneath Roslin's stones, but within the very heart of the Church. Not to be revealed, but to be waited upon. And when that day comes, if it comes, it will not be announced. It will be remembered. Quietly. Like something returning from exile, escorted not by angels, but by men trained to keep their eyes down and their lips sealed. There are maps, and then there are the maps you're not meant to notice. Not ink on parchment, but cathedrals aligned with stars. Castles placed like pressure points across the body of Europe. Patterns disguised as infrastructure, lines that whisper, ratios that echo something older than Christianity, older even than the Temple of Solomon. Geometry, sacred, precise, intentional, and through it all, a silent trail that some believe the Knights Templar left behind. Not just to mark territory, but to encode a secret they never dared speak aloud. From the beginning, the Templars were obsessed with architecture. Their commanderies were often laid out according to strict proportions, their churches built, with octagonal plans echoing the Dome of the Rock, where they were first headquartered. While most medieval builders followed loose Romanesque traditions, the Templars favored centralization, symmetry, alignment. Their chapels weren't just houses of worship, they were diagrams, blueprints. Some believe they were maps, and maps to what? That's where the whispers return. Because among the more arcane theories tucked in footnotes of Masonic manuscripts and buried in academic outliers is the idea that Templar architecture wasn't just inspired by Solomon's Temple. It was designed to locate what once lay within it, the Ark. The Book of Exodus gives dimensions for the Ark of the Covenant in precise terms: 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 wide, 1.5 high. These numbers recur curiously in the foundational measurements of several Templar sites. At Tomar in Portugal, in the Temple Church of London, even at the Château de Gisors in Normandy, sacred spaces seem to mirror Ark proportions, not out of artistic whim, but as mathematical homage, or breadcrumb. More compelling still is the orientation. Templar chapels often align not with Rome, but with Jerusalem, or more strangely, with solstice and equinox lines. The Church of Vera Cruz in Segovia, built by a Templar-linked order, has an altar that catches the rising sun at exact seasonal angles. A coincidence, possibly. But then you discover that the sun striking the Ark, according to ancient Hebrew tradition, was said to activate its divine presence. Light wasn't just illumination, it was invitation. And what about the golden ratio, the divine proportion? 1.618 shows up in nature. Renaissance art, and yes, in several Templar sanctuaries, long before it was popularized. Walls, columns, inner sanctums, all adhering to this sacred math. Not just for beauty, but for resonance. Some believe these dimensions weren't aesthetic, they were functional. Built to echo or even recreate the harmonic frequencies associated with the ark's operation. If that sounds fanciful, consider this ancient texts describe the ark not as quiet, but as vibrating, humming, even speaking. Perhaps the temples were built not to house the ark, but to remember its presence, to hold its pattern like a vessel remembers water. And then there are the circles. Circles within squares. Octagons within hexagrams. At Rosslyn Chapel, at Chartres, at Mont-Cenis, the geometry turns recursive, complex, layered, almost musical. Scholars have identified ratios within these layouts that correspond to musical scales. One researcher studying Rosslyn's architecture famously claimed to extract a musical score from its carved cubes, an audible relic encoded in stone. It sounds fantastical until you listen. Then it sounds like a chant buried for centuries. So why go to such trouble because knowledge hidden in architecture is harder to burn? You can seize a scroll. You can ban a ritual. But you can't unbuild a church. You can't silence stone. Perhaps that's why, as the Templars faced suppression, they didn't scatter in chaos, they left behind geometry. Buildings that outlived them. Floor plans as prophecy. Structures designed not just to survive, but to signal. As if the ark were never meant to be revealed again until the world had rebuilt its understanding stone by encoded stone. Some modern researchers have tried to connect these structures via ley lines, hypothetical energy pathways running beneath the Earth's crust. Fringe science, perhaps? But then you find that several Templar commanderies form near-perfect linear alignments across vast distances. One such alignment stretches from Jerusalem to Acre to Cyprus to Tamar, then angles outward westward toward the Atlantic, toward places like the Azores, like Nova Scotia, like Oak Island. It's tempting to dismiss this as pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist. But if the Templars were truly guardians of sacred knowledge, they would have understood the need for permanence. And what is more permanent than geometry? What is more enduring than the angle of light? The harmony of number, the shape that still sings long after the voice is gone. One particularly obscure manuscript, attributed to the 14th century mystic Jean de la Flèche, speaks of a vault, with no door marked only by music and proportion. He was dismissed as a lunatic. But if you trace the math in his diagrams, they correspond with the inner dimensions of the ark. His vault, a symbolic echo. A code waiting for someone with ears to hear and eyes to measure. And here is the lingering thought. What if the Templars didn't just hide the ark? What if they recreated it? Not the object, but the environment. A grid of sacred spaces across Europe and beyond, each built to channel what the ark once carried. Not physical power, but divine resonance. A network of holy frequencies. A map of spiritual memory. So perhaps the ark was not moved. Perhaps it was unfolded. Translated into angles, hidden in ratios, protected by stone, and maybe, just maybe, it's still singing. The ark may have vanished from the surface of history, but underground, beneath hills, ruins, and the bones of cities, it continues to echo. In certain places, the air itself feels watchful, as if centuries of silence are guarding something unspeakable. Hebron, Qumran, Ein Gedi, seemingly scattered sites around ancient Judea that taken together form more than a list of biblical footnotes. They form a pattern, a network of hiding places, vaults, and every one of them shares one thing in common, a whispered connection to the Ark. Let's begin with Hebron. Once the city of Abraham, Hebron houses the Cave of the Patriarchs, a site sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. But beneath that ancient structure lies something stranger than reverence. A foundation of megalithic stones, massive and carefully fitted, older than any known construction in the region. In the 12th century, Templar knights stationed in the area recorded rumors of a chamber beneath the Fathers, sealed with silence. It was said to hold relics from the first temple taken during the Babylonian siege and hidden in haste. One Templar account, fragmented, written in a mix of Latin and archaic French, describes an object carried by two never opened, whose presence bent the air. Most historians dismiss it as a reference to liturgical items, but if you've read descriptions of the Ark in Exodus, the resemblance is hard to ignore. Then there is Qumran, famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Qumran has long been regarded as a site of monastic life and apocalyptic prophecy, but less discussed are the tunnels beneath it. Narrow shafts and side chambers, some natural, others clearly carved, plunge into the earth beneath the ruins. Early excavators noted anomalies, sealed niches, hidden recesses, and once the skeletal remains of a man curled into a niche with a small ivory tablet clutched in his hands. No one could translate the markings. Among the scrolls found at Qumran, one stands out: the Copper Scroll. Already explored earlier in our journey, it's worth recalling that the locations it lists are not arbitrary. Many are linked to wilderness regions, rock-cut tombs, and dry riverbeds, areas ideal for concealment. Some of those sites are still unsearched, whether due to political sensitivity or sheer logistical difficulty. And then comes Ein Gedi, a lush, spring-fed oasis along the western shore of the Dead Sea. Ein Gedi is mentioned in the Bible as a place of refuge. It's also one of the sites where the Essenes, an ascetic Jewish sect, were believed to have stored sacred writings and possibly sacred objects. In one Jewish midrash, a priest named Shimon hides the fire of the mountain in a cave near flowing water, sealing it with a prayer. It may be allegory, or it may be memory. In the 1950s, Israeli archaeologists uncovered a ruined synagogue at Ein Gedi with an unusually stern warning written in Aramaic mosaic: "Cursed is the one who reveals the secret of this town." No secret is specified, no explanation given, just the curse. So what links all these places? They're all within a manageable day's journey of Jerusalem. They're all tied to priestly orders. And crucially, they all lie along routes known to have been used during wartime evacuations, from the Babylonian siege to the Roman sack. This convergence has led some researchers to suggest that the Ark wasn't moved once. It was moved repeatedly, not in a single grand escape, but in stages. Hidden, retrieved, moved again. A slow-motion exodus. Like a divine chess piece, always staying one step ahead of conquest. Which brings us back to the Templars. They were not just in Jerusalem. Records show that they made expeditions further afield, often described in vague terms like surveying or pilgrimage support. But if one maps their known movements in the region, the overlaps with these Ark-linked sites become difficult to ignore. Hebron, Qumran, Ein Gedi, and beyond that, Petra. Long thought to be a Nabatean trading city, Petra contains tombs and temples carved into living rock. But one structure, called the Treasury, has always attracted speculation. According to local Bedouin lore, it was used to hide a treasure so powerful the earth itself turned away. It's likely a conflation of tales, but the specificity of that phrase echoes descriptions of the Ark's presence: ground-shaking voices, divine disapproval. And yet none of these vaults have yielded proof. Excavations stall, ground collapses, wars intervene. It's almost as if something pushes back. There's an old idea in Kabbalistic thought that sacred things resist being found unless the seeker is spiritually prepared. That artifacts of divine origin are not just physical, they are bound to the intent of the one who searches. If the Ark exists, or even fragments of it, then perhaps these vaults have remained untouched, not due to lack of evidence, but because no one has yet earned the right to open them. Or perhaps the ones who did never left a trace. Maybe the Templars followed the trail into the Judean desert through canyons and catacombs and found what they were looking for. And then, as they did so often, they hid it again. Not in a vault of gold or guarded by dragons, but in places only geometry, prayer, and patience can unlock. Maybe the Ark still rests there now, behind stone and dust, humming softly under the layers of forgotten time. Maybe it has already moved again. But the vaults remain, waiting, not for archaeologists, for heirs. What if the Ark of the Covenant wasn't simply a container for sacred tablets, but a technology of consciousness? One that whispered to prophets, parted rivers, and leveled cities, not because it carried God's commandments, but because it was listening. You've heard the thunderous stories from Scripture, blasts of sound that shattered walls, clouds that moved with intelligence, voices that emerged from nothing, all of it attributed to the divine. But across mystical traditions, from Jewish Kabbalah to Christian esotericism and even Sufi interpretations, a different possibility begins to emerge. That the Ark wasn't just a symbol of divine presence, but a medium through which that presence could be contacted and controlled. Let's begin with the strange behavior of those who encountered it. Moses, when receiving instructions for the Ark's construction, is told to build it according to exact celestial measurements, not just in cubits, but according to a heavenly pattern shown on the mountain. Later texts would refer to this as a kind of divine blueprint geometry derived not from earthly function, but from cosmological resonance. The Ark's inner chamber, the Holy of Holies, was shielded not just by curtains, but by vibration. According to Second Temple traditions, only the high priest could enter, and only once a year after purification, rites so rigorous they bordered on alchemical. He would wear bells on his robe so that if he dropped dead from spiritual contact, others would know. Contact with the Ark was often fatal, not because it was a trap, but because it amplified emotions, intentions, even sins. This detail recurs in Kabbalistic sources, where the Ark is described as a mirror of the upper worlds. One must be clean to reflect the divine. If you weren't, it would reflect back something terrible. And then there's the role of sound. In the fall of Jericho, the Ark was carried before the army not as a war chest, but as a resonator. 7 priests blew shofars circling the city for 7 days, and on the final day, the walls crumbled. Some believe this to be metaphor. Others think the Ark was used to focus acoustic energy, amplifying natural resonance until structures failed. It sounds absurd until you consider that certain megalithic sites like Newgrange and the Hypogeum of Malta were tuned to specific frequencies that cause physical vibrations in the human body. It's not impossible, just forgotten. The Zohar, a foundational Kabbalistic text, goes further. It speaks of the Ark as a vessel not just of covenant, but of Shefa, divine flow. This flow wasn't symbolic. It moved, like light, like electricity. One passage hints that the cherubim atop the Ark, those golden winged figures, were not merely decorative but conductive. Their wings did touch, it says, and between them came the voice. In some interpretations, this voice isn't speech, but communication, not from mouth to ear, but from soul to soul. Medieval Christian mystics picked up on this theme. Hildegard of Bingen, in her visions, describes a golden ark, through which divine intelligence streams into the world, carrying both fire and memory. She never called it the ark, but her imagery was nearly identical. Circles of fire. Light that taught without words. A presence that judged by resonance, not commandment. Sufi traditions, though less overt, also hint at sacred objects that carry knowledge without speaking. In one account, a traveler enters a cave in the Sinai and finds an object that burns cold and sings without sound. He leaves blind in one eye, but with visions of future cities. So what does this all mean? It means that the Ark may have been more than a container. It may have been an interface, a sacred technology that linked human intention to divine pattern. And if the Templars found it even partially intact, it might explain everything. Their strange rituals, their secrecy, their sudden mastery of architecture, banking, and war. They weren't just soldiers, they were initiates, taught by the Ark or something left with it. We've already traced how the Templars may have uncovered vaults beneath Jerusalem, how they vanished with ships and relics, how their legacy was encoded in geometry and cathedrals. But if the Ark was a technology, not just a relic, then perhaps it taught them to see differently, to think in symmetries, to encode messages in stone and symbol. This theory of the Ark as a consciousness amplifier also sheds new light on why its guardians were so adamant about secrecy. You don't flaunt an artifact that responds to thought. You don't weaponize something that judges the soul. You hide it. You protect it. Because the wrong hands don't just misuse it, they suffer by it. Which brings us to the mystery of the Ark's successors. Across esoteric history, we find hints of objects that functioned similarly. The lapis exilis of Grail lore. The black stone of Mecca said by some to have come from heaven. Even the famed emerald tablet whispered to encode all knowledge in a single phrase. These may not be the same artifact, but they may echo the same principle that in certain times the divine places a mirror among men, not to judge, but to reflect, and maybe to guide. If the Ark was such a mirror, then perhaps it hasn't been lost. Perhaps it's simply waiting like a radio waiting to be tuned. A signal lost in time but not in purpose. And maybe, just maybe, those who still search for it are not archaeologists at all, but initiates. You've followed the trail of the Ark through temples, tunnels, and treasuries. But now the path turns inward into the shadowy realm of secret societies, whispered bloodlines, and guardians who guard not for glory, but for continuity. Among these, the name Priory of Sion surfaces like a ghost on parchment. You've heard it before, half in jest, half in conspiracy, but tonight we take it seriously. Because there's a possibility, however slim, that the Priory wasn't just a fringe fabrication or Da Vinci Code detour. It may have been the silent partner in a centuries-long game, and the Ark may have been its queen. Let's start with a contradiction. Most mainstream historians dismiss the Priory as a modern hoax born of 20th-century forgeries, planted documents in French libraries, and the eccentric antics of Pierre Plantard. And yes, the scandal around those documents, the so-called dossier secrets, is real. But what if that elaborate deception was not an invention, but a shield? What if someone needed the Priory to be dismissed as fake precisely because its history was real? You're probably wondering, what does this have to do with the Ark? Quite a lot, as it turns out. The dossier's secrets, for all their flaws, contain names that should raise eyebrows. Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Robert Fludd, and Nicholas Flamel, all listed as Grand Masters of the Priory. The common thread, each was obsessed with hidden knowledge, sacred geometry, and alchemical transformation. These weren't just artists or thinkers, they were initiates, map makers of invisible truths, and several left behind hints, subtle references to an object of covenant, often associated with light purity or divine instruction. But there's another clue. The priory's supposed origins lie in the Abbey of Sion, founded in the 11th century near Jerusalem, just before the formation of the Knights Templar. The two groups appear unrelated in official histories. But they shared territory, they shared symbols, and they may have shared a mission. Some researchers believe the priory existed to protect the bloodline of Christ, an idea wrapped in heresy romance and medieval politics. Others think its role was more arcane, the preservation of sacred knowledge lost at the fall of the temple. Now imagine this. What if the Ark and the bloodline were connected, not metaphorically, but physically? If the Ark was designed as a vessel for divine law and the bloodline carried the spark of divine right, then guarding one might mean guarding both. And in this theory, the Priory of Sion becomes more than a club of eccentric geniuses. It becomes a custodial order, one that operates in the background, while louder, flashier groups like the Templars take the hits. One guards the gate, the other hides the key. There's also a recurring architectural motif that links the priory to Ark lore. Many cathedrals and chapels associated with priory-linked figures like Saint-Sulpice in Paris or Rosslyn in Scotland contain floor plans and alignments that echo Ark dimensions. Not exactly, but rhythmically, in ratios, in acoustics. It's as though the buildings were tuned like instruments to resonate with something specific. Some say it's just sacred geometry. Others say it's a kind of homing beacon for a relic designed to respond. And then there's the mystery of the Grail. Yes, that old tale again. But listen closely. In several Grail legends, particularly the more obscure French versions, the Grail is not a cup, but a stone or a container of divine power carried by a brotherhood. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, the Grail is guarded by a group known as the Templiciten, echoes of Templars, echoes of Sion. And the object, it glows, it feeds, it communicates. You're starting to see the parallels. One of the most compelling connections comes from a little-known 17th century manuscript hidden in the Vatican archives, later referenced by a renegade Jesuit in exile. It speaks of a lineage of watchers independent of church control, whose charge was not to fight, but to witness. They were the keepers of the seventh key, and their symbol, two intersecting triangles, one pointing upward, one downward. The Star of David. Yes. But also the geometric essence of the Ark's layout. Why would anyone invent such an order if it didn't already exist? Or better yet, if it did and had to be forgotten? Here's the thing, when the Templars were shattered in 1307, the Church didn't just go after warriors. It chased symbols. It destroyed records. It hunted ideology. And yet fragments survived. Not just in Scotland or Portugal, but in the salons of Enlightenment Europe, in the manuscripts of Rosicrucians, in the blueprints of cathedrals, and the margins of alchemical texts. Little glimmers of a group that watched from the margins, always quiet, always just out of reach. So where does this leave us? If the Ark was ever found by the Templars, by the Cathars, by anyone, it would have required an infrastructure to keep it hidden. A system of codes, of rituals, of inherited trust. The priory, whether historical or mythical, fits that role too perfectly to ignore. And perhaps that's why the noise around it is so loud. Because when something is true but dangerous, the best way to hide it is to make it ridiculous. The southern slopes of the Pyrenees cradle a ruin draped in fog and legend Montségur. If Rosslyn whispers, this fortress screams, Its stones bear the weight of fire betrayal and one last secret. For centuries, this was the stronghold of the Cathars, those heretical Christians condemned not just for what they believed, but for what they might have possessed. And in the final days before their extermination, as flames licked the sky and the mountain bled its defenders, a small group escaped under cover of night. With them, legend says, went a great treasure. But no gold was ever found. No jewels. Only ash and echoes. So what exactly was it they carried into silence? Let's take a closer look at the Cathars not just as heretics, but as inheritors. They preached a stark dualism, a world of light and darkness, spirit and corruption. The Church of Rome, in their eyes, had lost its way. But this wasn't just theological rebellion, it was structural. The Cathars claimed to possess knowledge older than the Vatican itself. Some even suggested they were heirs to teachings smuggled out of Jerusalem, through Antioch, through Constantinople, and finally into the Languedoc. That's a stretch, sure. But then why were they so fiercely hunted? The Albigensian Crusade wasn't a footnote, it was a genocide, and it ended at Montségur. Now let's rewind to the siege. In 1244, after months of starvation and bombardment, the Cathar fortress fell. Over 200 prefecti, their spiritual elite, were burned alive in a mass execution at the base of the hill. But 4 people, it's said, escaped. Not just escaped, but descended by rope, carrying with them something so precious that it couldn't be left behind. This wasn't mere survival, it was extraction, a tactical withdrawal. Which begs the question, what were they removing that night? Here's where things grow strange. A few decades later, rumors surfaced across Europe that a powerful relic had been relocated to a hidden sanctuary, possibly one under Templar protection. That might sound convenient until you recall how close the Cathars and the Templars were in both geography and ideology. They weren't the same, but their circles overlapped. Montségur stood not far from several Templar holdings, and in some accounts, fleeing Cathars were sheltered by knights who owed allegiance not to the Pope, but to something older. Some even argue that the object removed from Montségur wasn't a book nor a relic, but a container, a chest, a box described in coded texts as the voice of God silent in stone. If that phrase sounds familiar, it should. It parallels numerous descriptions of the Ark across cultures, sometimes indirect, sometimes glaringly precise. Let's add another layer. French archaeologist Antonin Gadal, who excavated Cathar sites in the 20th century, found chamber layouts beneath Montségur that resemble initiation crypts, long narrow passageways ending in triangular recesses. One in particular bore markings aligned to the spring equinox, the same solar event, tied to the Templar calendar and to the inner sanctum dimensions of Solomon's temple. Coincidence, maybe. But geometry rarely lies. And then there's the folklore stories passed through mountain villages in Occitania. One tale tells of a sacred object buried not in Montségur itself, but in a natural cave known as the Grotta de Bethlehem, reachable only through a tunnel lost in a landslide. This object, they say, could blind the unworthy and speak to the faithful, not in words, but in visions. Sound familiar? These echoes recur again and again. Now think back, recall how the Templars, just decades after Montségur, were accused of worshipping a head or idol that spoke in tongues. Many dismissed that as invention, torture-born nonsense. But what if the idol wasn't a sculpture, but a misunderstood mechanism? What if the object moved between Cathar hands and Templar hands, surviving by changing names and guardians? This theory even caught the attention of Otto Rahn, a Nazi-era researcher obsessed with the Grail. He believed the Cathars held the secret, not just to eternal life, but to a technology lost to antiquity. His work was later twisted by Himmler's Ahnenerbe in their own grotesque search for relics. But Ron died mysteriously after visiting Montségur. Suicide, they said. Snow-covered mountaintop, nothing left but footprints. Convenient. The Vatican, for its part, has always denied any connection between the Ark and the Cathars. Yet documents from the Inquisition reveal a curious phrase uttered by more than one Cathar under interrogation. They referred to the Book of Light locked in a box of stars. Scholars assumed it meant scripture, but it also sounds astronomically precise, almost technological. So if the Ark was ever recovered by anyone, it would need to be hidden not in glory, but in sacrifice. Montségur was the crucible. It was not the end of a movement. It was the beginning of the Ark's second exile. A moment when the sacred passed from temple to mountain, from order to martyrdom. Which raises one final unsettling question: if the Cathars smuggled the Ark to safety, who has it now, and would they ever allow it to be seen again? The dust may have settled on ancient ruins, but the chase is far from over. In the quiet corridors of private archives in the arid dig sites of Ethiopia and beneath the marble floors of forgotten European cathedrals, the search for the Ark continues not as a myth, but as a mission. And the strange part, the ones searching today, are not all treasure hunters or conspiracy theorists. They include engineers, government operatives, clergy, and quietly funded academics who speak in whispers and sign non-disclosure agreements. There's a reason for that. Something out there still matters enough to stir movement in circles most people never see. Let's start with Ethiopia. For decades, the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion has maintained that the Ark resides inside a small, heavily guarded chapel in Axum. Access is forbidden. Only one guardian monk is allowed inside, and he's forbidden from leaving the compound. He's chosen for life. That in itself might sound like a cautionary tale or a clever way to deflect scrutiny. But recent expeditions have raised eyebrows. In 2020, satellite imagery picked up unexpected thermal readings beneath the chapel. Researchers speculated it could be an underground chamber, possibly a crypt. But shortly after, several journalists who attempted to get close were denied access by Ethiopian security forces. Some reported being trailed. Others had their equipment confiscated. Whatever lies beneath that chapel isn't just sacred, it's classified. Across the Mediterranean, other expeditions have been quietly unfolding. A European-led team funded through a university, whose name conveniently never appears in the final documentation, began sonar mapping beneath the old Templar stronghold of Tomar, Portugal. The aim, officially, to study architectural drainage systems. Unofficially, several team members later hinted at voids, empty chambers sealed long before modern record-keeping began. No artifacts were published, no images released, and a few months later, funding dried up. The project was abandoned. But one of the engineers later posted a cryptic comment online. The geometry was perfect. It matched something we weren't supposed to know. Then there's the matter of Oak Island. You might dismiss it as overhyped reality TV, and much of it is. But beneath the dramatics, the core remains intriguing. In 2017, a metal detection scan of one chamber 90 feet down showed signs of an ornate box with inlaid metal corners and unusual magnetic properties. No one could access it safely due to flooding tunnels. But the readings matched descriptions of ancient construction techniques, not colonial ones. And here's the real kicker. Some of the carvings found near that site contain symbols also found in Templar graffiti across Europe, particularly in Scotland and France. One such carving, a box with a lid rays emitting from it, and two angelic forms on either side. The symbolism may seem coincidental, but when those same images show up in Rosslyn Chapel in a Portuguese monastery, and in a manuscript recovered from Montségur, the pattern begins to hum with recognition. Someone is tracing something, and they're doing it quietly. Even Israel has its share of modern intrigue. In the early 2000s, a construction project near the Temple Mount was halted when workers uncovered a sealed tunnel with markings resembling Second Temple-era script. The site was immediately cordoned off by the Israel Antiquities Authority. No explanation was offered. Excavation plans were redirected. But a leak, of course, there was a leak revealed that a chamber had been located square in shape with 4 stone fixtures facing inward. One eyewitness described it as a shrine for something that was no longer there. If that sounds like an empty pedestal waiting for a divine occupant, you're not alone. Governments are interested too, and not just for historical reasons. Rumors persist that intelligence agencies have reviewed certain Ark-related claims as part of contingency planning. Not because they believe the Ark is a literal weapon, but because they know what it would do to belief systems if discovered. The destabilization effect alone could ripple through geopolitics, particularly in regions where religious tensions already simmer. The Ark is not just a relic, it is a fulcrum. Of course, not all searches are physical. Digital archaeologists, yes, that's a thing now, are scanning ancient texts using machine learning. One recent project analyzed the Copper Scroll and found linguistic parallels with hidden indices in the Book of Jubilees. Another algorithm flagged an obscure Templar inventory that described a sacred engine of breath and storm kept in shadow. When researchers cross-referenced that phrase with known Hebrew descriptors of the Ark, the linguistic overlap was startling. Not proof, no, but a sign that the trail may be encoded in places we've barely begun to search. And then there's the whispers that a private collector in Switzerland holds a carved lid fragment rumored to have once sat atop the Ark. That a shipment seized in Alexandria in 1983 contained gold overlay from the right century and region. That a chapel in Spain rings its bell once a year not for Mass, but for a relic locked beneath the altar never to be named. Each of these fragments by itself is a whisper. Together they're a storm of silence. You may be wondering if the trail is so hot, why hasn't the Ark been revealed? Perhaps because it's not about finding it. Perhaps it's about keeping it hidden. The search, after all, isn't just about possession. It's about permission. Who has the right to unveil a relic that could unseat centuries of theology, rewrite political borders, or shatter fragile balances of power? The answer for now seems to be no one, and so the search continues not in spectacle but in shadows. Not in museums, but in ruins. Not in proclamations, but in careful silence. The truth is rarely found in a single document, a buried chest, or a final confession. It reveals itself slowly, painfully, through the convergence of unrelated fragments, patterns hidden in plain sight. In the case of the Ark of the Covenant and its entanglement with the Knights Templar, the evidence has always resisted simplicity. But now, with so many threads tugged and so many doors creaking open just far enough, something new begins to emerge: a map. Not a parchment or scroll, but a conceptual lattice of movement, of secrecy, of deliberate placement. A map of shadows drawn not with ink, but intention. The idea is deceptively simple. What if the Templars didn't just stumble upon the Ark? What if they created a relay of concealment? A strategy not of transportation alone, but of obfuscation, ensuring that even if one trail was discovered, the others would mislead. It begins again in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount was no random headquarters. From the moment the original 9 knights occupied the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the choice was symbolic, architectural, and deeply calculated. The Templars would have known the original temple layout from their biblical studies and pilgrim testimonies. If they found any part of the Ark's chamber or any indication of its removal, they would not have drawn attention to it. Instead, they might have created false compartments, decoy relics, misleading inscriptions. Every stone turned would have been one they placed themselves. From the start, secrecy was the strategy. From there, the trail splits, but not aimlessly. If the Templars had recovered the Ark or related artifacts, the most rational next step would have been to remove them from the Holy Land entirely. Not for safekeeping alone, but for decentralization. France was the logical first destination home base to the Order's leadership and host to Chartres, Troyes, and other Gothic centers, whose iconography suddenly began to echo ancient Israelite themes. Scholars have long wondered why Chartres Cathedral includes a high-relief sculpture of the Ark, carried on poles by robed figures. It's not a random choice. It's a marker. But the French trail ends in fire. The 1307 arrests, the tortures, the public burnings, none of it was sudden. The Templars must have known it was coming. And if so, they would have scattered their secrets before the net closed. Which brings us to the fleeing ships. The fleet that vanished from La Rochelle was not built for cargo alone. It was built for escape, long silent and covered in darkness. Some ships likely headed to Scotland, where the Order still found protectors. Others may have turned toward Portugal, blending into the rebranded Knights of Christ. There, beneath the limestone fortresses of Tamar and Almirol, similar architectural alignments have been found, measurements that mirror Solomon's temple down to the cubit. But there's more. When you plot these locations, Jerusalem, Chartres, Tamar, Rosslyn, Montségur, on a map, something strange begins to happen. Lines appear. Angles recur. A pentagonal pattern emerges tied to the golden ratio, with each point falling not just on a known Templar site, but one linked to Ark legends. Coincidence is easy to claim, but geometry doesn't lie. This isn't mere Templar flair. This is a cartographic ritual, a sacred geometry of concealment. And then there's the silence. Throughout these locations, certain anomalies recur. Missing records from critical years. Statues removed or destroyed without explanation. Chambers sealed and never reopened. In Rosslyn Chapel, an underground vault exists that has never been excavated despite centuries of speculation. In Tomar, the round church is modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, but with deliberate mismatches in measurement, as though hiding a code. In Axum, the guardian monk who protects the Ark is replaced quietly without ceremony and never speaks again. These are not isolated quirks. They are signals in the static. One particularly strange case involves a forgotten priory near Zaragoza, Spain. Records from the 15th century describe a chest made of acacia wood bound in gold that was kept in the chapel under the floor. When Spanish inquisitors arrived in 1492, they found the chapel empty. But the altar bore Hebrew inscriptions none of them could read. The chest was never found again, nor was the monk who tended it. Another detail threads the needle even tighter. A 17th century Jesuit map, now kept in a restricted archive, marks a location in the Azores archipelago with the Templar cross, and a note in Latin ubi arca dormit, where the Ark sleeps. The map was later redacted, but a copy survived in a personal estate. That estate was raided in 1943 by unknown agents. No official record of the seizure exists. What if the Ark isn't in one place? What if it never was? What if the Templars divided it physically or symbolically across multiple enclaves, each holding a fragment, an echo, a guardian rite, the lid here, the base there, the poles elsewhere, the knowledge in code, the key in bloodline? Such fragmentation would make the Ark unrecoverable by force, and perhaps that was the point. The ark, after all, was never just wood and gold. It was function. To contain it, they would need to contain belief itself. And so the trail leads not to a single destination, but a network, a web of shadows, misdirections, and buried truths. It is not a chase that ends. It is a puzzle that sustains itself. One that still beckons the curious, the faithful, and the fools. You've followed every whisper, weighed every stone, and traced every crooked trail left behind by centuries of silence. Now comes the moment most dare not face the forming of a conclusion. Not a certainty, because the Ark of the Covenant, by its nature, resists that, but a theory. A synthesis of what's most plausible, most consistent with the available threads, and most aligned with the behavior of those who may have touched it last. Let's start with the question of possibility. Could the Ark still exist in physical form? The biblical descriptions, acacia wood overlaid with gold, carried with poles topped by winged cherubim, suggest an object vulnerable to age fire and conquest. And yet the reverence with which it was handled, the lengths to which men would go to preserve even its memory, argue against its careless destruction. Even if it was no longer used, the act of preserving it, burying it, hiding it, shielding it behind layers of metaphor and code, became an end in itself. The power of the Ark may have resided as much in what it meant as in what it did. So where is it? The Ethiopian claim remains the boldest. Axum's Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion has never backed down. Their guardian says he has seen it praised beside it and will die before he allows another to come close. Critics scoff at the lack of transparency, but that is precisely what lends the claim weight. The refusal to prove it, not from fear but from tradition, rings strangely consistent with the type of guardianship the Ark would demand. But if it is there, how did it get there? No Templar fleet passed through the Red Sea, no historical record connects the French order with Axumite Christianity. And that makes the Ethiopian theory feel more like a parallel legend than the direct Templar trail we've followed. The Temple Mount itself remains sacred ground, and perhaps the most obvious hiding place hidden in plain sight. Yet today, it is layered with political, religious, and logistical barriers that all but forbid any excavation beneath the dome of the rock. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed cavities, but without official access, we may never know what lies below. If the Ark remains anywhere in Jerusalem, it would be there. But the Templars, pragmatic and deeply aware of Rome's reach, may have seen that location as too exposed, even in their time. Scotland has always been a romantic possibility. Rosslyn Chapel teems with symbolism, and its unexcavated crypt tempts the bold. But Rosslyn feels more like a reflection, a mirror of the mystery rather than the source. The same can be said for Oak Island. Compelling, yes, tangled with secrecy and false starts. But if anything was moved there, it was likely something else. A decoy, a fragment, not the Ark itself. Portugal, however, offers a curious convergence. The Knights of Christ not only survived the purge, they thrived. They had ships, fortresses, allies in high places, and a deep interest in sacred relics. Tomar's circular church, modeled after Jerusalem's, could have been more than homage. It might have been blueprint and vault. The area has long been suspected of housing undisclosed chambers, and while no direct evidence of the Ark has surfaced, the region's quiet persistence is notable. The Portuguese never bragged about their treasures. They simply guarded them, and they still do. But let's entertain a final possibility: that the Ark was never meant to remain whole. The idea that the Ark was dismantled spiritually or physically finds support in the way the Templars operated. They understood redundancy. They understood that power concentrated in one place is vulnerable. What if they split the Ark's components, its physical elements, its encoded knowledge, its ritual use into different safeholds, one in Portugal, one in the mountains of France, one in the caves of Qumran, one perhaps even carried westward across the ocean where the map of shadows ends in forgotten vaults below forests and rock? This is the theory that holds the most weight, that the Ark still exists, but not as a single golden box. It exists as a dispersed relic, a living circuit of memory and meaning. No one person or group can reassemble it, because that was the whole point. It was never about access. It was about protection, not from enemies, but from misuse. The Templars were not perfect, but they were meticulous, and when faced with the choice to preserve or reveal, they chose preservation every time. Whether you call it the Ark or the light or the voice of God, it now rests in places unseen, behind symbols misunderstood, protected not by walls, but by legacy. And maybe, just maybe, that's where it belongs. Now, as the candlelight dims and the final echoes of steel-shod hooves fade into the silence of forgotten corridors, you are left with a question, not of where, but of why. Why would generations of men, warriors, monks, architects, mystics, go to such unimaginable lengths to protect something no one could openly claim? What compelled them to endure secrecy, suffering, and sacrifice, all in service of an object that history has buried beneath layers of myth? The answer, perhaps, is not in what the Ark was, but in what it symbolized. To the ancient Israelites, it was covenant. To the Templars, it may have been continuity, a bridge between divine authority and human stewardship. And to those who still chase its shadow, it remains an idea too powerful to die. In their silence, the Templars told us more than words ever could. Not every treasure needs to be seen. Not every truth wants to be found. Some secrets keep themselves, so breathe easy now. Let the trail soften behind you like footsteps in mist. The vault is sealed, the guardians have faded, and the Ark, wherever it sleeps, no longer needs to run. It is safe. And in some way, so are you.